Welcome to Human Monsters. George Waterfield Russell Jr. was born on April 2, 1958, in Florida. He acquired the nickname the Charmer, the cause of which will be revealed later. His parents separated during his infancy. His mother eventually remarried, and mother and child moved to Mercer Island, Washington, to live with his stepfather. A man named Boris Brockett knew George in the 7th grade, as he recalled. He was short, like me, had a big round, bubbly face, big eyes, a loud, infectious laugh. He's your best friend in a second. He emphasized that his name was George Russell Jr. I asked if he was related to Bill Russell, and he said he thinks so. I got the idea he didn't want to get personal. My mother took one look and said, "Watch out for that boy. He's trouble." But after she got to know George, she was totally charmed. He was polite, respectful. Even as a little kid, he had this uncanny ability to make you like him. An easy style, warm, very southern. His favorite food was grits. He called me Boris. When I asked him what part of the South he was from, he shrugged. He finally said he was from Maryland. Indeed, though many were charmed by George, he was so enigmatic that few understood him, hence what Boris Brockett came to characterize as, quote, the mystery of George. Enigma, mystery, secrecy, these are the things that every criminal must understand and establish, especially when it comes to doing things that would incur society's wrath. Once, when Boris visited George's home, he asked what George considered to be one too many personal questions, and he was never invited there again. Though George was intelligent, he struggled with his schoolwork. Despite having an IQ of 180, which is considered to be in the gifted level, it would be problematic in the future since he declared his intention to work in the aviation industry, as so many residents of Mercer Island had. As one 8th grade teacher put it, he is bright, but immature. Small for his age, antsy, hyper, all over the place. You couldn't get mad at him. He wasn't the least bit malicious. He kept us all laughing, but he just wasn't interested in schoolwork. He wanted to play. As long as I knew him, he was a playful little boy. Commenting on this, George once said to Boris, "I only pay attention in classes I like. I don't need those goofy little art classes. I always feel like, let's speed this up." As an adolescent, George got into some petty mischief, possibly truancy, and the local youth bureau sentenced him to do some community service work at the local police station. To quote Officer Glendon Booth, "The first time I saw Georgie, he was in trouble for some petty thing, maybe truancy, and the youth bureau given him some work around the station. He was 13 or 14, a little bitty kid, well-dressed, frail, innocent, very likable. He could charm your socks off. He was the last kid on Mercer Island you'd expect to turn into our biggest nightmare." Eventually, George took a shine to the police force and decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. Police, especially detectives, get to be quite inquisitive, and picking at the bones of a person becomes habitual, even when it's not socially appropriate. George firmly, but diplomatically, made it clear he didn't want to discuss his private life. George became an asset to the Mercer Island PD. He ratted out some of his contemporaries when they committed crimes. He became a scholar of police procedures, even going as far as to accompany officers on ride-alongs. Police officers develop a highly tuned intuition after evaluating suspects for several years. Officer J.C. Goodman gave his impression of George as he perceived him at the time. You couldn't help feeling sorry for him. Myself and Sergeant Smith, we tried to help him out because even though he didn't want to talk about it, we could see his personal life didn't seem to be going real well. So we gave him even more to do, kept him busy around the station. Eventually, George and Boris grew apart. As Boris tells it, I changed, and George didn't. I was getting interested in girls. George was too, but he was secretive about it. It was something else he kept to himself, how he felt about girls. His style attracted younger kids. I preferred older company. This led Boris to realize he'd never known George at all. A Mercer Island PD officer commented on George's dynamic with younger children. He was always skinny, didn't reach 5 foot till high school, and I think he felt sort of intimidated by people his own age. He could be a big shot with the littler kids. He craved that attention, people looking up to him. It was something he didn't seem to be getting anywhere else. George's parents enjoyed a high status on the island, despite representing a fraction of a minority of African Americans. His mother was a teacher, and his stepfather was a dentist. Their standard of living was common on the island, which was known for its materialistic culture and contempt for the underclass. Though it appeared his family were living the American dream, he was still highly secretive about what went on behind closed doors. His mother was not welcoming to his friends on the rare occasions when they visited. George became accustomed to living the kind of life where one keeps dark secrets from outsiders. He had plenty of friends, but no intimates. That would have meant that they would learn his secrets, and those were strictly off limits to outsiders, ensuring that he would remain an outsider in his own right. George struggled to fit in as a high school student, though he was generally well liked. Being of such diminutive proportions, his efforts on the basketball court did not rise to his or others' expectations. His friend and alumnus Tom Hager detailed what he remembered about George at that time. He was so bright, so entertaining. He had an incredible memory. He wanted to be a writer and kept an ongoing list of our dead schoolmates. He'd sit in his room and write out their stories, good stuff, publishable. He had stacks of yachting magazines, how to find the right sailboat, how to make your own, how to rig for storms, hurricanes, stuff on motorcycles, guns. We read spy magazines, went to spy movies. It's odd, considering the way things turned out. But in our adolescence, we weren't big on girly magazines. We read them, but they weren't a special interest. Mainly we were dreamers. Anything was possible. We'd smoke a joint and ramble on. We'd get on our bikes and ride to Luther Burbank Park, the Burb, and talk about sailing around the world. George had maps of every ocean on his walls. He figured out the winds, how to cross the Indian Ocean, how to handle the currents at Tierra del Fuego. We read popular science and decided we were going to build a submarine. We went down to my dock and got into plastic garbage cans with locking tops, made a seal, locked them and put a hole in the top, screwed a hose into it. Then I said to George, "We got to be crazy." We both started laughing. George said, "This'll never work." He was right. We decided to open a restaurant in a little house on the water. 2 teenagers. That idea died in about an hour. We knew we were dreaming, laughed about it, kidded each other. He wanted to be a detective, but we didn't buy the crime magazines. He was into CIA stuff, where you nicked somebody with an umbrella tip, and they died 3 weeks later. Spies, intrigue. He had secretive ways. He'd stand outside my room at night and flash his little light till I saw him. He'd say things like, "People in lighted houses can't see out their windows. That's important to remember." I'd say, "Why is that important?" And he'd just shrug and smile. Nothing seemed to bother him. He got along with everybody. No, I take that back. George didn't like to be excluded from anything. If he got left off a team or didn't get invited to a party, he'd sulk. I always wondered, what the hell did George get left out of when he was a little boy in Maryland? Was that what made him this way? I never found out. One activity George greatly enjoyed with his friends was a game they called Army. As a friend named Larry Victor remembered, George always won. Before you could take 2 steps, you were dead. He had eyes like a falcon's. Kind of like the way you would describe a predator. As far as his racial pedigree went, it was a touchy subject with George. He avoided black peers and did not take an interest in African American culture and history. In fact, on more than one occasion, someone would say something to him to the effect of, "George, you're the whitest guy I've ever known," and it appeared to please him. As for his love life at the time, there was none. He had crushes on plenty of girls, but they were always out of reach. This was a common problem, however, as most of the girls on the island came from wealthy and upper-middle-class families, and people like George and his friends were looked upon as unworthy. George chafed against his status among his friends as the token black more than he let on. As Tom Hagar put it, they treated him like their favorite eunuch. He projected the image of the pet black, and that was fine with the socialites, but they left him out of things that mattered. They pretended to accept him as a friend because they knew they'd never have to take him seriously. I always felt this helped to cause the rage that came out later. Because he was tight with lots of girls, and they tempted him like they tempted the rest of us, but they never let it go anywhere. George was permanently excluded, and knew it. Those lily-white sashes were never going to put out for the local black guy. George just kept suffering. Never complained, that would have been uncool. But we all felt that pain, not just George. Racing hormones. He rarely confided about girls. It was another subject he wasn't open about. He told me he wanted love, not sex. He was always looking for the ideal woman to put up on the pedestal. But the ideal woman wasn't looking for him. George got involved with petty crime along with his peers. He usually found a way to avoid facing consequences, but the police were aware of his malfeasance. They still allowed him to volunteer at the station, and their offer to help him become an officer still stood, but they warned him that he must straighten out his behavior, or else the offer would be withdrawn. He was cut loose by the force when he began discussing confidential police data with his peer groups. His friends recalled that this led to a marked sea change in George's disposition. It was the kind of disillusionment of a person who is bereft of purpose. His behavior reflected a newfound sense of pessimism and a loss of faith. As a junior, he skipped classes, drank alcohol, committed theft, took pills, and smoked marijuana. He appeared frequently in juvenile court, where he was often successful at talking his way out of sentencing. He had the markings of an attorney, but by then he was drawn to the other side of the law. George's parents were determined to set him on a more constructive path. They registered him with another high school, one where he would not be tempted into petty crime by his peers. His stepfather was integral in carrying out this strategy, saying, "I don't care if a man's black, yellow, or green. There's nothing that a human being can't accomplish through hard work and diligence." George was unhappy with this new arrangement. He discussed his personal feelings with Tom Hagar. To quote Hagar, George could hardly discuss it without shaking. Dr. Washington had warned him that a black person had to work harder and longer and faster. That formula was going to save George's ass. Dr. Washington didn't understand that George's only ambition was to get by without working. They were bound to clash. The first morning, Dr. Washington came into George's room at 4:45 and said, "Up and at 'em, man. The kennel needs to be cleaned. The dogs need to be washed and fed." Horror. George said every day started at dawn, except hunting days, when they'd get up at 2. They'd drive a couple hours, and Dr. Washington would throw a big pack on George's back, hand him a 13-pound shotgun, and lead him into the slough at full trot. They'd hunch down on a patch of ice, and Dr. Washington would say, "Now we're going to shoot some ducks." They'd wait for hours. 10-degree weather, snow, slush, wind. Dr. Washington would jump up and fire a few shots. God forbid he hit anything, because George said he had to clean it. George told him, "Hey, we can buy these things at the market for $5 a piece, already cleaned." They'd get home late, smelling like duck shit, and George would have to wash the dogs, clean the kennel and gear, and oil the shotgun, eat dinner and break out the books. This was against everything he'd ever stood for. Dr. Washington kept thinking that George would adjust, finish high school, maybe serve a hitch in the service, followed by college at government expense, and a high-paying profession like him and his old friend Wanzel. They thought George would slide right into the program. He was an enigma to all of them. Wanzel, Joyce, Dr. Washington, all those black overachievers who pulled themselves up by their own intelligence and hard work. George couldn't relate to them any more than he could relate to a wombat. Too bad. It might have saved his life and a few others. George's immersion in crime was not deterred by his stepfather's attempts to reform him. He continued to recruit younger kids into committing petty offenses for and alongside him. Other times he would scam them out of money and the usage of their automobiles. One cop commented on these activities. He developed a bunch of wannabe George Russells. They met in video stores, Denny's, the 7-Eleven. There'd be 100 kids milling around that store. King George would go inside and buy beer for them, stash it in the woods. He also supplied weed and discipline. He never liked to fight, but he kept those kids cowed. It was almost impossible to prosecute him, because the kids were too scared to snitch. If they got out of line, he'd flash his knife. He'd take one of the rich kids aside and say, "Lend me your car. I'll be right back. I got to pick up a friend." The kids were too afraid to complain when he kept it a day or two. That became a habit. He was, quote, borrowing cars the same way 10 years later. One day, Sergeant Glendon Booth of the Mercer Island PD caught George putting a stranglehold on a boy. George's explanation? The punk wasn't cooperating. Remarkably, the parents did not press charges. On another occasion, he beat up a 9-year-old boy for inserting a slug in a video machine. As Booth put it, it offended his sense of control. It was okay for him to slug those machines, but nobody else. Some officers staked out a 7-Eleven one day, watching through binoculars. George Russell came out toting several six-packs and walked into the woods. He also made a few drug deals. He was arrested, which included a pat-down. The arresting officers found 2 kitchen knives and several baggies of pot on his person. George only received probation for those charges, but his nascent criminality would not be denied. He would soon be charged with criminal trespass, possession of marijuana, second-degree burglary, possession of stolen property, and an offense called nuisance noise. Since he had turned 18 by then, he served 3 days in jail. He reoffended upon release and served 4 days. Having failed to learn his lesson, he offended again and served 32 days. He still managed to get lenient sentences because of his charm and gift of gab. George began to subject old friends and neighbors to his criminal activities. As Tom Hagar recalled, George lived at night. He would hide in bushes and learn your habits. He was patient. He'd watch a house for a week, if that's what it took. He would slip through any opening. He got into one house through the dog port. He knew that our doors were always unlocked, and the keys were always in our jag. So, when I was away at college, he started borrowing it after midnight. When he finally got caught, he told the cops he had permission. This was just too much, and our family decided we had to do something. We put together a complete dossier, arrests, convictions, plus everything he'd gotten away with since junior high, and presented it to the judge. When you saw it on paper, it was an eye-opener. George ended up serving 35 days. It was his longest stretch, and everybody hoped it would straighten him out. When he was released, did he stay away from our house? Not George. He made it a regular target. We had a sliding glass door. That was his entry point. My mom had a stash of silver dollars that she gave out as rewards. George took 6 or 7 at a time. I guess he figured she wouldn't notice. Think about it. The guy's slipping into our house at night, risking a felony burglary charge for pocket money. There had to be some other motivation, but we didn't learn what it was till it was too late. Other stuff began disappearing. I came home from college on a break and ran into him at Luther Burbank Park. From 30 yards away, I recognized my old orange coat. He was wearing my sweater and pants. He asked if I wanted to get high. He looked terrible, wasted, like every other bum on the street. It brought a lump to my throat. George was the brightest, the most interesting kid I'd ever met. He still had that smile, that big laugh, but you could see he was lost. I said, "George, that's my down coat." He said, "Oh, is it?" He sounded kind of vague. "Here, let me give it back," avoiding the question of where he got it. I said, "Christ's sakes, no, I don't want it back." It was beat up, dirty. I felt guilty because of this huge gulf between us. I said, "If you'd asked me for the coat, George, I'd have given it to you. The point is, how did you get it?" He evaded the answer. I wasn't going to push. It was about that time that the Mercer Island PD began receiving reports about a night prowler whose physical profile was described as a man of color. George was kicked out of his parents' house. He took liquor, money, and clothes with him. By then, George's mother no longer lived in the house, and his stepfather took in another woman, her name being Chris. Rumor has it that George came onto the woman, leading to further tensions in the household, and possibly to his stepfather's decision to kick him out. Reportedly, Chris always felt uncomfortable around George after that incident. George moved in with a friend for a time, until the friend noticed that his possessions were disappearing. George was kicked out of the friend's house. Officer Glendon Booth reported on other developments in George's life from that time. He was sleeping in abandoned houses, under neighbors' houses, in high grass, in his old forts. He removed the vent from the swimming pool heating duct and crawled in there. Did the same with the grate at a bank. It was like Goldilocks and her bears. Folks would come home and find the bed messed up, the heater turned on, food on the table. If there was snow on the ground, You could track him in and out of every yard on the north end. The Ferris family had a boat cabana, and they'd come down in the morning and find him wrapped around the base of the toilet. A friend let him sleep in his crawl space. There was an old garage back in the woods near his home, and he finally moved in there. No heat, no light, no toilet. We'd shine our police flashlights through the blackberry bushes, and he'd peek out and yell, "No problem, officer. Thanks for checking. I'm fine." Then he'd say, "How's the wife? How's everything at the station? Gee, I'll have to drop in and see you guys." Some of those nights, it was below freezing. We didn't have the heart to turn him out. By then, George became a career thief, breaking into houses, pickpocketing, and taking any items of value he could get his hands on. Sometimes he would impersonate a police officer with his Seattle PO cap and school patrol badge. He would use these dubious credentials to intimidate kids who were doing drugs in the wilderness. He didn't even have a full badge, and he was abusing his artificial authority. When George served time in jail, he cozied up to the staff, using his charm and knowledge of the legal system to ingratiate himself to the administration. As popular as he was with the brass, it was a completely different story with the inmates. The black inmates didn't trust him, considering him to be an Uncle Tom and a snitch. When he tried to connect with them on their level, it always came across as awkward and contrived. He was no brother. He was more often looked upon as an Oreo. He admitted to a white inmate that he'd rarely been friends with black people and had never dated a black girl. While it's admirable to be colorblind on the outside, the incarcerated stick to their own race. So George had to tread lightly. He spent most of his sentence in his cell, engrossed in his hobbies. George drifted from one menial job to another. He was known to become unpleasant toward females after a few drinks. As one friend put it, George tried to surround himself with girls, but he never really liked them. You only had to watch from 5 minutes to see it. Nobody knew why. He eventually got fired from his only source of steady employment and once again relied on theft to sustain himself. A friend described the nature of George's social relations at the time. There were people he would steal from, and some he wouldn't go near. There were girls he wouldn't try to put his arm around, and others he tried to screw full bore. He was a street psychologist. He knew who he could push and who not. He certainly wasn't loyal. Police offered him compensation for being an informant. Whenever a friend committed a crime, George would turn them in. In some cases, he set up a crime for the police to prosecute. Eventually, he lost his age-appropriate friendships as a result. As he had years earlier, George began cultivating friendships with younger people. They were easy prey. He used them for companionship, money, power, control, and sex. A girl named Laura Green was 14 years old when she became acquainted with George Russell. She recalls the trajectory of their interactions. "I still don't know how it happened. I didn't have a neurotic need for an older man, and I wasn't a victim of an unhappy childhood or bad parenting. I had a good childhood, and my parents were great. They never made me feel that sex was dirty or obscene, and they weren't uptight about it. They were bright, professional people, upper middle class. Sex didn't seem dirty to me, just something to look forward to. When I was little, I dreamed I'd be a teacher, or I'd grow up and marry a gorgeous guy and live on a houseboat in Florida, or I'd own a store or a restaurant. Normal dreams. A few months after my 14th birthday, in between the 9th and 10th grades, I was planning to go to Christian camp for a week, and I was hanging out with my best friend V and some other girls. They were smoking a little pot, but I'd tried it twice and didn't like it. I'd also tried some heavy petting, not much, and I smoked cigarettes. My sins. I guess I was pretty average for my age. One hot summer afternoon, V and I were smoking behind a dumpster when this black guy walked past, then stopped. He came over and talked to her, but he didn't even look at me. He was good-looking, slender, not tall, talked fast, laughed a lot. He looked about 20. His nails were real long. I thought that was probably for cocaine. I figured, that's his business. I could care less that he was black. I'm not prejudiced. It doesn't matter to me if you have purple hair and 5 thumbs on each hand, as long as we can communicate. Actually, I found his skin tone kind of exciting. He was pretty much the only black person I'd seen on Mercer Island. At the 1-week camp, I became a born-again Christian. I talked about religion constantly, bored my friends to death. I still smoked, but I didn't drink or fool around. One night, some other girls and I went to V's house for a party. Her parents were the kind of people who grew pot in their bedroom and didn't hassle her. So we'd go to the 7-Eleven and buy candy and ding-dongs and bring them home for a party. It was me, V, who was 13, her sister, B, who was 16, and another 13-year-old girl. I was surprised when George showed up with beer. He still didn't pay much attention to me. As the night went on, you could see that we were giving him something he needed. Made him feel good, laughed at his jokes, hung on his words. We thought he was cool. He seemed totally comfortable in the company of 4 girls, talking about ourselves and our friends. He gave the impression that he totally cared. He'd ask questions to draw you out. I thought he was just about the most interesting man I'd ever met. I never stopped to think, why is this guy hanging around kids? Why isn't he working or in college? We saw a lot of George. We went with him to Luther Burbank Park and Denny's, sat up talking till all hours. Kids are used to being ignored by grown-ups, and here comes a guy who'll spend 2 hours discussing why 13-year-old Kevin snubbed 12-year-old Sarah in the lunch line the other day, and whether it means Sarah should confront him about it, or play it cool, or maybe take Tyler for a fallback boyfriend. He'd get so intense, you'd think he was discussing world problems or the H-bomb. It couldn't have been an act. He was concerned. Nobody could fake the interest he showed in our lives. He always had books in his pack. Deep stuff, not junk. He used big words, and he knew everything. When I'd be at V's for a sleepover, he'd show up around midnight and tap on the window. We learned to expect him. We wouldn't sleep. Just before daylight, he would open the window and disappear. Mysterious, exciting. He always had money. One morning, he took us to Winchell's Donuts in Bellevue and paid with $100 bill. I'm going, oh my God, he's a drug dealer. It scared me because I was beginning to have a crush on him. He could see we were freaked about the money, so he said, you guys need to learn not to jump to conclusions. Didn't I tell you I made a lot of money managing Tonight's the Night? Well, I saved it. He flashed a big roll. Here. That eased my mind. The next time he came over to V's, I was laying on her bed, smoking, and he said he'd never go out with a girl who smoked. I put out my cigarette. I knew he noticed, but he didn't comment. The next time I saw him, I said, hey, George, I quit smoking. He seemed pleased. He seemed to know every teenage kid on the island, who they went out with, what they did with each other, whether they were fooling around. I didn't realize it at the time, but he had this terrific capacity for gossip. People magazine was his Bible. He could talk all night about Donald Trump and TV stars and stuff like that. I never asked myself if this wasn't odd. A grown man so involved in talking about his friend Lynn Brown, for example, and how she was sleeping around, and how she once met him at her door naked, but he turned her down because she was just a silly nympho. Nowadays, I would say, who cares, George? But to a teenage kid, it was fascinating. Around 4 one morning, he started talking about devils and demons. He told about 2 Satanists in San Francisco who were trying to draw a pentagram on the floor and couldn't get it right. George said, if you're safe inside a pentagram, you can conjure up demons, talk to them, get them to do things for you. Money, anything you want. Then his voice turned deep, hushed, and he said, but if you step outside the pentagram, hun, they'll kill you. Where girls hugged each other harder. He said the cops found one of the guys dead the next morning, laying outside the pentagram, squashed flat, blood everywhere. There was no way anything could have fallen on him. It was the demons. I started to cry. George patted me on the shoulder and started talking about how you could use Ouija boards to conjure up demons. He said demons can be good, but they're always dangerous. He said the devil could take a pencil and spin it on its axis and kill everybody in the room who's not a Christian. He made me so scared I threw away my mom's Ouija board. A couple of nights later, George was giving us his usual playful hugs, and we were laughing and kidding. We would lay on the bed, and he'd put his arms around us and not let go. Incredible hugs. It was exciting, but I didn't connect it with sex. Everybody in Mercer Island hugged. Everybody said, love ya. It was just friendly. We asked him if he did drugs, and he said that the devil had frightened him off. He said he was high on coke one night and broke a mirror, and when he bent down to pick it up, he saw the devil's red leg behind him. He said he dumped all his drugs after that, and he put everything else in his room under a white blanket. He said he could speak in tongues, but he only did it when the Holy Spirit entered into him. To somebody who'd just been to Christian camp and gone forward to accept Christ, it was very impressive. One night, V started teasing him about sex. She asked, what turns you on? He said, nature. And we were like, no, George, we mean really. And he said, I hear you, and that's my answer. Nature turns me on. It seemed like he didn't want to open up, so I said, George, what gives you an orgasm? He looked like he didn't understand, so I said, George, what makes you come? He changed the subject. You could see it was something he didn't want to talk about. To me, it just made him seem more lovable. He was like a shy adolescent. We stayed up all night and into the morning. We took the bus to Seattle, to Pike Place Market, a tourist place where a lot of kids hung out. On the way, I told V I was getting a crush on George. That made her start playing up to him, hugging, flirting. I thought, oh no, he's never going to like me if she's always in his arms. It made me feel so bad. At the market, V wouldn't stop flirting. George saw me crying. That told him how I felt about him. I went to one of the stalls and bought him a pin that said, love you, George. He said, you wear it. So I put it on. A couple of nights later, V fell asleep on her bed, and George started talking about God and how great it was that I was a Christian and didn't drink or use drugs, and how I'd quit smoking for him. We hugged and kissed and talked about God. Then his hand started moving, and he showed me where to put my hand. I didn't think it was inconsistent with my religion. George was very religious. How could it be wrong? I was attracted to him even more. I was a virgin, but most of my friends were making out. I knew Mercer Island girls who'd slept with 10 or 12 guys. I wasn't shocked. It was just the way things were. George and I talked for 2 hours. And then he led me into V's laundry room and asked if he could go down on me. I didn't know the expression. When he explained what he meant, I thought, wow, this guy really wants to be with me. We made regular love for the first time at a party, and it hurt real bad. The next night, he came over to my house after my parents were asleep and knocked on my window. We talked a lot and then did it again. And the next night and the next, we worked out a set of signals. If I hung a blouse in the window, it meant too dangerous, stay away. If the coast was clear, George would tap his long fingernails on the window and shine his pen light. After we'd been together for about a week, he said, "Can I go down on you again?" I thought, what's the matter with the normal way? It wasn't as though he couldn't get hard. He was always hard. It seemed like he was just trying to see me have an orgasm to get my reaction. He said he wanted to get me horny so he could lick my juices. He said he liked my taste and wished he could drink me with a straw. I didn't know if he was weird or just trying to make me feel good. Then he made me go down on him. I mean, I didn't have any choice. He acted kind of loving about it till I resisted. Then he turned a little mean. After that, he made me do it every time. It didn't seem like he really cared how I felt. He'd go down on me till it hurt, like it was for his pleasure, not mine. I'd yell stop and pull away, and he'd drag me back. He was rough, but not really abusive. I loved him. But if he'd been cruel, I'd have stopped then and there. My parents' bedroom was upstairs at the other end of the house. My older sister knew what was going on, but I swore her to secrecy. George and I were pretty quiet. He'd be with me 5 or 6 hours and leave when the sun came up. We never used protection. George said we didn't need it. Sometimes he pulled out. Once we fell asleep and almost got caught. We heard Dad in the shower, and George said, "Shit, gotta go." It was daylight. He sneaked home by the back way. He seemed to enjoy taking risks. On the way to my house, he'd jump fences or through yards, get chased by dogs and cops. He was stopped a few times, but talked his way out of it. "I'm just taking a shortcut. I'm sorry if I bothered you. I'm George Russell. Live on North Mercer Way. Maybe you know my dad. He's a dentist." A radical line of bullshit. It always worked. People wanted to believe George. In public, he treated me like his girlfriend. We swam at Luther, went to a movie and a couple of concerts in Seattle, took the bus or went with friends, but mostly it was midnight sex at my house. I wouldn't know he was coming over till he got there. Sometimes he'd be in my room when I got home from a babysitting gig or one of my jobs, and I'd be, "George, how'd you get in?" He never explained, and we passed over it. It was odd, because he could have shined the light or tapped on my window to get in. He seemed to prefer to sneak in. Maybe he just wanted to stay in practice. Sometimes he wouldn't show up for a week or so. He'd explain he was out doing his job as a narcotics cop. He showed me how they'd communicate by touching a nose or an ear, and it would be a signal that he had to drop everything and meet his crew somewhere. That was all he would say about his job. He was secretive about his family, too. It was like he'd come from a test tube. I never knew where he went when he wasn't with me or hanging out with us kids. He wouldn't even tell his middle name. It turned into this big thing. "Come on, George, what's your middle name?" "I'm not going to tell you." "What's it start with?" "W, that's all I'm going to tell you." I finally dragged it out of him. Waterfield. I asked where his folks came from, and he acted like he wasn't sure. We lived in Florida, and I looked like buckwheat. That's all I know. He said he would have been born an April Fool's baby, but his mom held out till midnight so he could be born on April 2nd and not be teased the rest of his life, but he never told me what year. He claimed he knew nothing about George Waterfield Russell Sr. He said the only father he'd ever known was Wansel Mobley. Dr. Mobley's wife, Chris, was only 12 years older than George. George never referred to the Mobleys as step this or step that. It was always my sister, my dad, my little brother. The only exception was Chris. He called her his stepmom, even though they weren't really related. It was like he wanted to belong to a regular family. Don't we all? It didn't matter how many times I tried to learn about his family. He just kept turning me off, or he told stories about them that sounded made up, like he wanted me to believe they did all these great things together. One day he said, my little brother was playing baseball, and I said, hey, $5 if you hit a home run. The next pitch, whack, a home run. He's amazing. Does that sound made up or what? His favorite person in the whole world was his half-sister, Erica. Evidently, they'd been tight before she went east with their mother. Now she was at Yale, and he just missed her to pieces. When she visited Mercer, he treated her like God's gift to earth, took her everywhere, introduced her as Erica, my baby sister. There was something unreal about that, too, like he was trying to convince himself of a closeness that didn't exist. He seemed to regard personal questions as an attack. He'd glare at me without answering. I thought, if we're going to get married, I have it right to know. He let slip about a time the family was on a driving trip, and he deliberately tried to dump baby Erica at a gas station. I thought, Erica? The visiting royalty? He told me how he'd carried the baby inside the station and left her in her bassinet. Just before they drove off, the attendant ran out and said, hey, is this baby yours? That story bothered me. My own family was tight and loving, and I couldn't understand how anybody could hate their sister enough to try to dump her at a gas station. George just giggled and acted like it was no big deal. His real mother, Joyce, was a touchy subject. For a long time, he wouldn't talk about her except to say she was a hotshot professor and genius. Little by little, I found out that she'd taught English at Tufts and lectured on black culture. George said she'd also taught at Maryland and the U of Washington, and her lectures were in big demand. Now she was married to a famous guy named Corrigan. He'd been chancellor of the University of Massachusetts before becoming president of San Francisco State. George said his mother was on the faculty. He talked as though him and his mom and his stepfather were real tight. He referred to Dr. Corrigan as Bob, but little things made me wonder. I asked him for a picture of himself, and he said he'd get one from his mom. When it didn't show up, he mumbled something to the effect that she didn't have any. I said, your mom doesn't have her own son's picture? He ignored me, and when I mentioned it again, he got mad. After that, I noticed that anything about his mother set him off. It only made him more fascinating. When we were at a rock concert in Seattle, some of my friends gave me a lot of crap. They said, George robs people. He's a cat burglar. He's a pimp. He's this, he's that. They said, you know, George is 28. His class graduated 10 years ago. I'm like, when? I got really nervous because I didn't know anything about this side of George. I confronted him and he laughed and said, 28. He made it seem like a joke. I'm thousands of years old. I'm an angel of God. May 18th, 1987. George was released from King County Jail. He was now 29 years old. He moved back to his stepfather's house on Mercer Island. 7 months in the can did not correct his ways, and he fell back into crime. Local police discovered he was buying beer for minors and introducing them to weed and pills. 5 weeks after he was released, he had been kicked out of his family's house and was now squatting in a maintenance room in Puget Sound Bank When police busted him there, he was charged with criminal trespass and possession of a dangerous weapon, that being a butterfly knife. He was sentenced to 5 days in jail and was ordered to undergo psychotherapy. George reported to his first therapy session and underwent a behavioral assessment procedure called MMPI, or Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. A quote from the doctor's report. Mr. Russell has already spent 2.5 years in jail since 1983, and further jail time at this point does not seem to be the only or the most appropriate response to the current offense. This is a report the doctor prepared to Judge Suzanne Staples. Mr. Russell presented himself initially as a fairly relaxed, confident, friendly, and outgoing individual, although he could acknowledge having made some, quote, errors of judgment. He mostly presented himself as the victim of a legal system that was overreacting to his transgressions. He displayed little insight into the underlying attitudes or thought processes that are associated with illegal behavior. Psychological testing with the MMPI, however, presents a view of Mr. Russell which is much deeper than the rather likable, superficial image he presents to people initially. People who respond to the test as he did are usually seen as rather self-centered, limited in their capacity to form deep interpersonal relationships, quite impulsive, demonstrate poor judgment, and have little patience or frustration tolerance, become bored easily, and seek excitement, often taking risks without considering consequences, are often rebellious toward authority figures, and may have trouble incorporating the traditional standards and values of society. Essentially, the doctor diagnosed George Russell as being antisocial in his behavior, i.e., a sociopath. He envisioned a brighter future for George, however. As he put it, George appears to be making progress. He has been working regularly, continuing to reside with his parents, no indications of alcohol or drug abuse. The Mercer Police Department were not quite as convinced. J.C. Goodman developed a theory that George's proclivity for home invasion was not merely fulfilling in terms of acquiring material items. He believed George derived a thrill from these pursuits. To quote Goodman, "Through George's late 20s, we had a long string of nighttime burglaries. On warm nights, people would leave the sliding door open, and the guy would actually walk into the bedroom, and there'd be signs that he stood right between the two people. Every officer in town knew it was George, but there was seldom enough evidence to even make an arrest for criminal trespass. It reached the point of almost being a joke. Whenever we got a burglary report, it was, 'Anybody know where George is at?' I guess the closest we came to nailing him for house prowling was one night when some people heard a burglar upstairs. Sergeant Smith tangled with the guy and they both fell off the deck, and the guy got away. He was black, skinny, wiry, the right height and weight, but it was too dark for a positive ID. There's no doubt in my mind George was our cat burglar. George was stealth. He liked the cockiness of walking into somebody's bedroom and standing there thinking, I can do anything I want to you people. I'm in command, I'm the power, and I'm not even trying to intimate that George had any thoughts of doing physical harm, because I didn't think he did. Not at first. The situation turned more complicated when a dark-skinned robber broke into a Mercer Island home and tied up a woman in the bedroom, then assaulted another female a few days later. A newspaper artist's rendition resembled George, but neither victim could make a positive identification. Most of the local cops were convinced that their old mascot was the daytime robber. A few argued that the M.O. was too dissimilar. Paranoia spread among families that George had been victimizing for years, some of whom hadn't bothered to report their suspicions to police. His childhood best friend's mother, victim of the silver dollar burglaries, installed an expensive alarm system. After a third attack by the daytime robber, the latest victim viewed a file photograph and said, "I know George Russell. It definitely wasn't him." The island's pet criminal was quietly exonerated, but not everyone got the word. Old friends avoided him. Parents glared. For 15 years, he'd blamed the problems on the cops, the courts, his accomplices, the phases of the moon, and now he found himself ostracized for 3 robberies that he didn't commit. It was a bitter pill. Glendon Booth weighed in on George Russell's metamorphosis into a hardened criminal. George used to have some respect for his friends, but now he was ripping them off right and left, threatening people, losing his cool. I walked into Denny's when I was working graveyard one night, and this little waitress, Robin, was in tears. George says, "Oh, hi, Sergeant Booth. How you doing?" I said, "How you doing, Georgie?" Robin pipes up, "He stole my money." I said, "How do you know?" She told me how she had just counted out her tips in front of her old pal George, $28, and then put the money in a Crown Royal bag and stuck it in the waiter's station. Soon as she turned her back, it was gone. She said George is the only one that could have taken it. He saw where I put it. I was really pissed. I thought anybody that'd steal from Robin would steal from the blind. That little girl worked hard for her money, and everybody admired her. I stood George on his head, but nothing dropped out. He's yelling, "It's the dishwasher. I saw him take it." I knew he'd stashed it someplace. I searched the bushes, even climbed up on the roof. I wanted his ass so bad. But no money. Robin was crying, saying something about George was her friend. She'd known him since they were kids. I says, "George, get off this island. Don't you ever come back here." He says, "You can't tell me what to do." "Well, George, I've been friendly with you for years, but you've worn out your welcome with me, man. I got no more use for you. I eat in this place. I don't want you in here, and they don't want you in here." So he was 86'd out of Denny's, just like he'd been 86'd out of gas stations and the 7-Eleven and the market and a bunch of other places. They handed him a formal letter threatening him with criminal trespass. There was a high turnover at the Mercer Island Denny's, and George bided his time till the management changed. Then he was welcomed back. 1988. George Russell Jr. turned 30 this year, but came no closer to maturity and stability. He bought a new car, but smashed it up. He was hired by a Nintendo arcade as a clerk, but he skimmed $23,000 and was fired when he was found out. He was shunned by his family, friends, and distrusted by the same police he once worked for. Even his gigs as a snitch for the Seattle PD dried up. He became a vagrant like never before, sleeping in parked cars and dumpsters. He neglected his hygiene to the point that during a court appearance, the judge said, "Be sure to shower before you come into my courtroom again." He still had friendships, but they were fleeting due to his tendency to steal from them. It was about this time that George frequented a nightclub called the Black Angus. One female regular recounted what she remembered about George and her interactions with him. "I first saw him at the Black Angus when I was 21. He was there every night, came and went by himself. He seemed to know everybody. Bartenders, the disc jockey, the waitresses. He'd stand at the door talking with the bouncers while they carded people. He seemed real nice, very different, a fun guy, a host type, very sweet. My girlfriends and I noticed that he avoided black women. I didn't understand. I dated black men almost exclusively. I liked dark features, dark eyes, dark hair, the black look, Mexican, Italian. George was too white for my taste, and I didn't like the way he dressed. I like men in pressed jeans, a neat look, hair arranged and up to date. George always wore sloppy jeans, a white shirt, casual, not much jewelry, definitely not GQ. He wore that old style of modified fro. He didn't seem to fit in with blacks or whites. He always seemed to be in a good mood, never pissed off at the world like so many of the other guys. He'd give me and my girlfriends a hug or a nudge. We just thought, it's only George. He called us Hun, and we called him G, or George of the Jungle, or Honey Bear. He always had a drink in his hand, but he never acted drunk. He didn't seem to have any steady girlfriends. A couple of my friends wanted to jump his bones, but he never seemed to take them seriously. It was just a social thing with him. Sex wasn't important. He'd flirt, but wouldn't follow through. He drove one girl home and sat in her car for 3 hours, lecturing her on her love life. We didn't know what he wanted out of women, but it sure wasn't sex. We had no idea where he got his money or where he went when he left the club. He was clever about evading personal questions, so we stopped asking. He told somebody he had a girlfriend in L.A. and visited her sometimes. A few assumed he was gay. I just thought he was eccentric. We wondered why we never ran into him anywhere else in Bellevue. I kept telling my friends, don't you think it's just a little strange that we don't know anything about the guy except that what we see in the club? One night he paid for a round of drinks with $100 bill, and I said, come on now, George. What do you do? Where do you work? He looked agitated. I asked him again, and he said, I'm a cop. I work undercover, in the clubs. It made sense. He never took his jacket off, even when he was sweating on the dance floor. We figured that's where he kept his gun. For the first time, George seemed exciting. George's ex-girlfriend, Mindy Charlie, remembered the salad days of their relationship quite fondly. But eventually George's behavior became peculiar and unsettling. To quote Mindy, he'd start the evening in one set of clothes and come home in another. Or I'd drop him at the bus stop, and 15 or 20 minutes later, he'd arrive at the Black Angus in a different outfit. I'd say, George, where did you change? He had a different explanation every time. After a while, he just shrugged me off. Money was a problem at the Angus. Sometimes he'd come over to my table and slip a $5 bill into my pocket and walk away. On most nights, I was lucky if we danced one dance together. But George was worth it. We'd been together less than 2 months when things changed big time. I didn't know much about boy-girl games, and I didn't understand. Breakfast in bed came to a screeching halt. He turned snippy and cold. One day I defrosted the fridge, and he asked what I'd done with the stuff inside. I said, I put everything on the counter. I sloshed in a few buckets of boiling water, cleaned it up, and put the food back in. Why, he said. There was a piece of foil in there, Min. What did you do with it? What do you mean? I had a piece of acid in there. He sounded like a schoolmaster talking to a bad kid. I was supposed to take it into King County to have it tested. I did a drug bust last night. I said, George, please believe me, I never saw it. He didn't flip out, but his cheek muscles were pulsing. Then strange things began turning up. I found a hand-tooled turquoise bracelet and a ring hidden in my china creamer. I asked where they came from, and he said it was police evidence and he had to turn it in downtown. 5 bullets and some more bracelets showed up in my wicker hutch. He told me they were mementos of a police job. One day I was dusting my bookshelf, and a double-edged razor blade flipped up and almost hit me in the eye. George said he had no idea where it came from. 2 weeks later, I reached into my soap basket and cut my finger on another blade. I was so naive, I didn't suspect what he was using it for. Sometimes he gave me explicit instructions not to disturb him and went into my spare bedroom for one of his rituals. He would spread a bath towel between two candles and sit cross-legged, and he wouldn't let me see what he was reading. I didn't have the heart to complain about it. Pretty soon our main contact was the cold little instructions I'd find when I got up to go to work. "Mindy, will you fix this shirt? Wake me at 5 p.m. if I'm not up." He never signed his notes "love," and he seldom said "please." Whenever I wrote a response, I went out of my way to say "I love you." He didn't reciprocate. Somehow I'd gone from lover to housekeeper. It didn't enter my mind that he was seeing anybody else. If I make a commitment, that's it, and I can't imagine anybody else cheating. I began hearing disturbing things from friends at the Angus. "George doesn't think of you as a girlfriend. You're just a friend. You're just roommates." I confronted him. "Why are you telling people we're not boyfriend and girlfriend?" "I'm not telling people that, hun." "Where do you get those ideas?" "There's a few girls that I don't tell about us because I'm trying to help them, and if they thought I was living with somebody, they wouldn't feel close to me. They'd withhold things, and I couldn't help them out." So I'd say, "Well, what about your male friends? Why are you putting me down to them?" "They're pulling your leg." In the middle of August, he began these closed-off moods. After all those years dealing with an upset mother, it was hard on me. I could always tell by the way he held the newspaper whether he would be receptive to conversation. He had the most effective way of closing you out. You could say something to him, and it was as if you hadn't opened your mouth. Total indifference. It wasn't like he was upset at me or ignoring me. It was like I didn't exist. I'd get so upset. "What have I done? Why are you mad at me?" Silence. The paper wouldn't even rustle. After an hour or so, I'd start to cry. Somehow he knew that silence was the quickest way to hurt me. No, it wasn't like talking to a wall. When you talk to the wall, you at least can pretend that the wall's absorbing something. With George, there was nothing, no sense that he'd even heard you. He'd go days like that. I'd say to myself, "Okay, fine, it's over." I'd start to go out with my old girlfriends. Then he'd be nice again, for a day or two. It was like he didn't want me, but he didn't want me to be with anybody else. I decided I had to fight back, and my car was my only weapon. After I cut him off, he developed a pattern. He'd ride the bus home from the clubs at 3:30 or 4 in the morning, stash his duffel bag in the bushes, walk a mile and a half to the 7-Eleven, buy the paper, then walk back home, exactly the same, night after night. Could it have had something to do with the ongoing cat burglaries in my neighborhood? 30 or 40 of them? But I didn't learn about the burglaries till it was too late. When I heard him coming in, I would get out of bed and ask, "How'd things go tonight?" No response. "George, did you hear me?" "Yeah," he'd say in this stoic, cold, even voice. Then he would stretch out on the couch with the paper. I tried to make myself numb. I felt completely screwed over. We never went anywhere together. At the Black Angus, he'd come over to my table and have a drink, but he wasn't with me. Or he'd say, "I need the car. Here's an extra $5. Have another drink. Catch a ride home." Just when I thought things would get better, they got worse. If I came through the front door of the club, he slipped out the back, or he would dance with his favorite blonde and not even acknowledge me. I began to realize that this was the most unhealthy relationship imaginable, worse than the one with my mother or the one with Chris, because George was so cruel. He picked up on my insecurity and used it to dominate me. At last I was beginning to see the pattern. The trouble was, I was still in love. He went to King County Jail for 10 days in September, and explained that something had gone wrong on one of the stings. I was still trying to believe his stories, but I was dubious. My 23rd birthday came up 2 days after he was released, and I decided that we had to do something together. Any old thing. A walk. Dancing. Whatever. The frustration was getting to where I couldn't handle it. When I got home from work at 5:30, he was in one of his closed-off moods, laying on the couch, reading his favorite work, Crime Scene Search and Physical Evidence Handbook. I sat in the bedroom till 9:30, then came out crying. Can't you at least say happy birthday? After all the nights when you're out on a job or doing something with your friends, all the nights when I sit home, why can't we do something tonight? He slowly lowered the magazine and looked at me like I was an amoeba or something. He said, "Mindy, you just blew everything. I was going to take you to dinner and then to the Black Angus, but if you have that attitude, forget it." Then he called his old girlfriend in L.A. and talked till I went to bed. I decided the only way to live through this nightmare was to treat him like a roommate. You do your thing, I'll do mine. Just pay your share. Toward the end of September, when we'd been together for almost 4 months, he said, "I don't have any money for the rent." Another shock. I prided myself on making that $425 payment every month, even if it meant skipping meals. I said, excuse me, just what am I supposed to do?" He said, "Hawk the ring I gave you, hun." I didn't have any choice. I went to Diamond Bank with a couple of friends. The stones were 0.8, 0.7, and 0.4 carats, but one was chipped. We got $330. Later he gave me 3 or 4 more rings, said they came from the lost and found at the Black Angus. I hawked them for $60, and we applied it to his back rent. Then we got the bill for the L.A. call to his old girlfriend, and it was over $100. He wouldn't pay it, and I couldn't. When they disconnected my phone, George was like, "It's no big deal. Who needs a phone?" I was still going through mood changes. Oh God, I'm in love with George. I'll make it work. I'd leave him a note saying that I loved him, and he'd reply with some instructions about his laundry. I realized that in 3 months, together, he'd never used the word love. I thought, why am I bothering? Why am I doing this to myself? In October, he brought an old girlfriend home to stay with us while she was in the process of moving. She was a pretty little thing, a dancer, about 16. They acted like they'd been intimate for years. He brings her into my living room, introduces her as his friend Lynn Brown. Hi, real jolly. She lifts her long leg over her head and presses it against my wall. I'm going, oh, how nice. How talented. I wish I could do that. Hey girl, I'm desperately trying to save a relationship with this guy, and you're shoving your crotch against my wall? I found out later that Lynn used her sexuality to make friends, but she was too young to know that this kind of behavior annoyed females. She pitched her sleeping bag in my spare bedroom and stayed with us for a week. The night George brought her marijuana, I just about lost it. I said, "Excuse me? She can do whatever she wants, but I will not condone smoking in my apartment." He said, Sure. When she left, I found some marijuana hidden under a cushion. By that time, I was well aware that he was hiding things from me, lying, running one scam after another. Sometimes it made me angry, but it also made me curious. He always left his royal blue duffel bag locked with a half-inched silver padlock. He was touchy about that bag. He knew the exact position he left it in. He even knew when his cat Sasha jumped on it. I opened it with the key from my jewelry box. Inside there was a t-shirt, boat shoes, and about 10 little scraps of paper folded in 4s. I'd seen him flipping through those papers before, but didn't dare ask about them. On the outside of each piece, I found license plate numbers, phone numbers, names, addresses. On the inside, there was every bit of information he could get: social security numbers, occupations, work schedules, likes, dislikes, kids, pets, etc. He told me he sometimes traced people for his friends, and I figured it was connected with his police work, but why not keep the information in notebooks? Why these silly little scraps? By November, I knew I was in a desperate situation and had to get out, but I was still in love with him. A part of me wanted to help him, save him, because I had a pretty good idea where he was headed. Once in a while, my sweet George would come back. It was like he was trying to keep me off balance. Bad guy, good guy, but mostly bad guy. He gave me a 1/2-inch round ruby ring in an antique setting. Said it belonged to his grandmother in Florida and was worth a lot of money. It touched my heart. I forgot every cruel thing he ever did. One of my friends worked in a jewelry store, and he said it was corundum, man-made, worth about $60. I didn't care. To me, it was the most valuable ring in the world. I'd sit and stare at it. George knew how I felt, so after our next fight, he said he wanted it back. I'd always known he would use it as a weapon, so I'd hidden it under my nightstand. He stormed into the bedroom, leaning over me, yelling, "Give me my ring, now!" He scared the hell out of me, so I gave it back. It broke my heart. Later that night he came home drunk with a white friend. It was 4 a.m., and they were headed somewhere. I tried to find out where they were going, but George just walked out the door. I said, "George, excuse me, excuse me." He turned around and came back in, and I tried to hang on to him to make him realize I needed to talk. That's how low I was. He shoved me down and jumped on top of me. He stopped strangling me when his friend ran in. After they left, I looked at myself in the mirror. My neck was black and blue. I guess I still wasn't low enough. A week or so later, he turned abusive again, then went into his shell. I followed him around the house, raving and ranting, telling him we could never save our relationship if we couldn't communicate. He ran into the bathroom. I was wearing Keds, and I stuck my foot out and I said, "You're not shutting this door on me." He tried to slam it, and it hit my foot and popped off the hinges. He looked shocked. He threw the door open and punched me so hard that I fell backward into the kitchen and slumped against the fridge. He walked past me and was gone. I could feel the goose egg swelling up on the side of my head. I didn't know what to think. I'd seen hundreds of women hit by men, but only on TV. About a month before Christmas, he was driving me home from the Black Angus around 1:30 on a Thursday morning. I'd had too much to drink, and I was saying, "George, why don't you just leave? Why put me through this? Why can't we just end it and I get on with my life?" He didn't answer. By now I recognized that wall of silence as pure hatred. I said, "Okay, fine, don't talk. Let me out." We were half blocked from the apartment complex. "I'll walk. I don't want to be with you another second." Without thinking, I left my purse in the car. A freezing rain was coming down. My heel broke off in a puddle. I was drenched, sobering up fast. I took off my heels and walked barefoot. When I got home, my car wasn't there and I was locked out. I banged on my door. No answer. I thought maybe he'd hidden my car and gone inside. He'd pulled that trick before. I sat on my porch, shivering. Every few minutes I knocked again. Inside I could hear the cats going crazy. At 3 o'clock, I used the bushes for a bathroom. I thought, how low can you get? I was crying. My cats were crying. I knocked every 15 or 20 minutes, loud enough to be heard inside. Inside, soft enough to keep from waking my neighbors. I figured George was on one of his all-night deals, but why hadn't he waited to let me in? When the sun came up, I was still huddled on the mat against my door, so I couldn't be seen from below. I was afraid the neighbors could hear me shaking. The mat was the only warmth I had. No coat, no jacket, no hat, nothing. Windy, crying, freezing. The manager arrived at 8:30, a sweetheart, very fatherly and concerned. I looked like shit when I stumbled into his office. He said, "No problem, my dear," and unlocked my door. George was reading the paper on the couch. He'd been in there all the time. It was worse than a sock in the face. I said, "Why didn't you let me in?" He didn't even look up. I said, "What was the point?" No answer. I just took a long hot bath. When I got home the next evening, a car was parked in my spot. I heard a girl screaming, "George! Oh, George!" I thought, no way. I ran up the 3 flights of stairs. They were making love on the waterbed. I just stood there. They didn't even notice me. I said, "What the hell are you doing?" He said, "What are you doing here?" She rolls over and says, "Oh, is this the girl you told me about?" They're both stark naked and acting like I've got a problem. I finally broke. I said, "George, you get out of here right now." He goes, "Not till you pay me $3,000, hon." I'm screaming at him, "What are you talking about? Just get out." "No, you pay me for all the rent and everything else. I'm not leaving till then." The woman pipes up, "You got nothing to worry about, honey. I'm only here for the day. I'm from San Francisco. I'm leaving tomorrow." Neither of them made a move to dress or get out of the waterbed. "Pay back my goddamn money or I'll have you hurt." I just took off. I didn't know what to do. I called my ex-boyfriend Chris, and he said, "Get over here right now." I slept in his living room. In the morning, I called the Mercer Island police and asked for Officer Kettles. That was the only name I could remember. The dispatcher said he wasn't available. I said I'd been having problems with George Russell and just wanted to talk to someone. She said, "Oh, everyone's had problems with George. He's harmless." It made me feel stupid, so I said, "Oh, okay." Chris drove me home. On the way, he told me he was sure that George had stolen his expensive high-top sneakers and asked if I'd mind if he searched the apartment. I said it wasn't a good idea right now. In my heart, I still couldn't believe that George would do something like that. The San Francisco woman was gone, and George was asleep on the waterbed. He was all apologies. I was drunk, man. I made a mistake. It was a one-time thing. I'm sorry, hon. We talked it out. No more relationship from now on. We'd strictly be roommates. He would take the spare room and respect my privacy. I thought, I'll live with it. Financially, I had no choice. At 5 the next morning, he served me breakfast in bed. We were lovers again. Then George and a female friend won the Black Angus Square Cow Fun Bar Mexican Super Cruise for 2, from L.A. to Ensenada and back. I wasn't jealous. She was a mutual friend, very nice, filled out hundreds of tickets, and spent a lot of her own money to win. When they got back from the 4-day cruise on December 16th, I found a pair of panties in his laundry. George laughed and told me it didn't mean anything. He promised to take me to his mother's vacation home in the Bahamas, but we never got around to it. Christmas was coming. I knew it didn't mean a thing to George. He hated holidays, and he'd get angry if you even mentioned his birthday. The only holiday he enjoyed was St. Patrick's Day, because everybody partied. A week before Christmas, I unpacked my aluminum tree, the one Chris had knocked down the year before. I just couldn't decide whether to put it up. Christmas meant so much to me, but this year I had no money for gifts, a shaky relationship with George, and my mom and I were hardly speaking. I'd halfway decided to spend my Christmas at work selling cards. After a while, I said to myself, "Hey, Mindy, Christmas is your day. It doesn't depend on getting along with others. It's a special, sacred, pleasant, perfect time." I set my tree on its stand and unwrapped my ornaments one by one. That always had a therapeutic effect on me. Calming, rejuvenating. Every ornament had a story. Some went back to when I was a baby. After I turned on the tree lights, I got so inspired, I went out and bought a little Christmas village for my bedroom with tiny people and another little tree. George looked at the Christmas stuff like it smelled. When I asked him what was wrong, it went into his sulk again. I tried to be understanding. Christmas can be hard on people without a close family. I'd never heard him say a word about his natural father. He was on the outs with the Mobleys again, and as far as I could see, he had no communication with his mother at San Francisco State. No phone calls, no letters, no cards. Once in a while, there'd be a postcard to Russie from Ricky, his half-sister Erica. But otherwise, George was an orphan. When I offered a little comfort and love, he turned his back. The same old crap. So we had another fight, and it turned into Custer's last stand. I stormed into the kitchen and yelled, either pay attention to me or get out. The next thing I knew, he'd picked up my aluminum tree and speared it at me. He knew it all about the fight with the Christmas before, and exactly what buttons to push. I was leaning against the counter, and the branches brushed my ear. Everything shattered against the wall. I just kind of fell in a heap. I think I went into shock. My hand touched something. I picked up the remains of a little pipe cleaner, candy cane, that my sister had made for me when she was like 2.5. And I scratched my hand on a broken glass ball, a memento of a trip to Disneyland. I sat there rocking, moaning. No, not again. Please. God, please. Not again. Over and over. After a while, I picked up the candy cane and went into the bedroom and sat on the bed. I thought I was going to lose control. It was the closest I ever came to walking down the street to the Fairfax mental hospital and saying, "Put me in those funky clothes." I must have sat there for an hour. Finally, I stopped crying and came out of the bedroom to pick up the pieces. George was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, rocking back and forth, bawling. He looked pathetic, haunted. I saw shards of glass in his hair, and his shorts, and his sneakers. He wasn't wearing a shirt. He kept saying, "What have I done? What have I done?" He cried so loud I raised my finger to my lips and said, "Shh." I thought he would disturb the neighbors. I didn't touch him or comfort him, but I felt a compassion, sympathy. I flashed on the word schizophrenic. I didn't know that much about psychiatry. I went back into the bedroom for a while, and when I came out, he was sitting on the floor, working on 2 of the broken figurines, a porcelain man in the moon, dipped in velvet, and a penguin bell that my sister had given me the year before. He was trying to glue them together with model cement. I watched for a few seconds and turned away. At that point, I couldn't stand seeing him do something nice. It was too confusing. He repaired every possible piece. I put my tree back up. It was bent, but it was Christmas to me. The next day, George came home and said, "Here, hun, this is for you." He gave me 2 whale drawings, hand-drawn by a kid at Denny's. He said they were designer drawings, especially for me. Then he gave me a plain gold friendship band, very thin, 12 carats. I thought, why does this guy have so much power over me when he acts soft and timid? All I said was, "George, why are you doing this?" I hoped maybe I'd see his sensitive side again. His voice turned brusque. He said, "Well, I'm not proposing or anything, Min, but this is as close as I'll ever get." A month or 2 earlier, I'd have fainted with joy. Now I just wondered, what does this mean? It sure didn't mean marriage. In a few days, the ring disappeared. Sergeant Booth noted that George Russell's criminal activity was no longer strictly relegated to fraud and property crime. He was becoming increasingly violent. As Sergeant Booth tells it, "Most of the years I knew George, he wasn't violent with adults. He carried a knife, claimed it was for protection, but it was mostly for bluff and for prying into houses and cars. Now he starts carrying 2 knives, threatened to slice a guy's throat, slapped a woman in a bar and had to be restrained. Women set him off. You seldom heard of George going up against a guy. He usually backed off or claimed he was a police officer. You could see his level of violence was going up. The old George would smile and pick your pocket, and you'd say, "Thanks, George, anytime." Now he was becoming more aggressive. No more kids to push around. Dealing with street people his own age. Losers. Unemployables. I'm thinking something's going to give here. Something's going to happen. But in the United States, you can't arrest people for what they're gonna do. You gotta let them do it first. It was about this time that a man named Stephen Douglas Clandle met George Russell. While the men were getting acquainted, George identified one of his heroes, and Stephen was befuddled by George's choice of a role model. As he tells it, he starts rapping about Ted Bundy. Sounded pretty passionate and really fascinated. Called Bundy a star, a genius guy, famous, cool. He was like, Bundy created his own fame. No matter what you do, you'll never be able to say the name Ted Bundy without knowing who he is. I'm like, what is this shit? To me, Bundy was a sick fucking bastard, and he needed to fucking die. But George is saying, there's a lot you can learn from a guy like that. I said, yeah, well, Bundy's right up there with Himmler and Hitler and every other mass murderer. They said they were smart, but yet, they had to kill everybody and make their life complete. Then he went off on some woman's book about Bundy, maniacal, raving up and down. Fucking bitch, she doesn't know shit. She's out for a fucking dollar. Raving. I noticed there were no specifics, nothing. I got the impression it was because the author was a woman. Like, what right does a woman have to judge one of my heroes? During that time in George's life, he invited a woman to his apartment, and she was shocked by what she saw. As she put it, he had stacks and stacks of detective magazines, the kind with women being hurt on the cover. He said he thought he could pull off the perfect crime if he just read enough. A cocktail waitress at the Black Angus recalled George addressing her as bitch and scratching her back with his trademark long fingernails. Mindy Charlie recounted the ugly denouement of her relationship with George. I lost it. I yelled, "You awful thing." I was crying, screaming. You've been using me all this time. If you walk out that door, you're taking your stuff with you. For good. He started down the stairs. I grabbed his duffel bag and his box of porno books and threw them out on the third-floor landing. George was still headed down the stairs. I picked up the duffel bag and it came open, and Chris's missing high tops fell out. That was the end. I thought, what kind of a person would steal somebody's shoes? George had sworn over and over he'd never seen those shoes. I pitched the duffel bag over the edge, and it fell 10 or 15 feet to the parking lot. I swear George was racing up those stairs before the bag hit the ground. I ran into the apartment, and he chased me. His face was a blank. It was like he was on autopilot. He began throwing my things against the walls. Our cat Sasha ran behind my wicker hutch. He methodically destroyed 3 shelves of dishes and stuff, every picture on the wall, every video cassette and music tape, everything in my cabinets. I grabbed at his arms, clawed at him, trying to protect my possessions. It had no effect. There was no comprehension in his eyes, only animal anger, no control at all. The only sound was me screaming for him to stop and him grunting as he tore things up. I tried to jump on his back and he dragged me from room to room. Superhuman. I kept yelling, "Don't touch that. Please, George, don't touch that." After he was done with the living room and the hallway, he walked past Terry's door and into my bedroom. I had an antique Victorian lamp remake, one of my prized possessions, and he smashed it. He ripped out the phone and threw my mattress across the room and broke my bed. I ran at him again, and he slammed me against the wall. When I came to, he was pulling clothes out of my walk-in closet and throwing them on the floor. I staggered outside. My shoulder and head were throbbing. I could hear my own heartbeat. I yelled, "Please, God, help me. Anybody, help me." I couldn't stop screaming. There were 6 apartments in my stack, and nobody was home. I finally reached the bottom of the stairs. George's friend Brian stood in front of his car, looking dazed. You could still hear George wrecking things up above. an animal growl. Ah, ah, ah. I'm crying. Help me. Brian just stood there. I ran to another stack and banged on a door. A man opened up, pulled me inside, and called 911. While he was on the phone, he held my hand, trying to comfort me. I heard him say on the phone, I don't think she's in any danger, but the guy's still out there. We waited for the cops. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. In desperation, I called the Mobley house to ask what to do next. I said, George beat me up. Wanzel said, What? Who is this? I go, This is Mindy. Your son beat me up. He trashed my apartment. He hurt me. Wanzel said, Excuse me, but George is not my son. The police arrived in 15 minutes. I was supposed to find that George hadn't touched my wicker hutch, where I kept my prized china. A little ball of fluff was hiding there, trembling. It was Sasha. Everything else was in pieces. The floor was covered with broken glass. The cops advised me to get away for the night. George might come back, and Terry was still at her volleyball game. I called Tammy Grace and went over there. I still wanted to talk to Chris, so I dialed the Mobley number again. I almost fell over when George answered the phone. He was like, Oh, hi, hun. Cool, calm, like he was hearing from an old friend. I went, He said, Why are you calling here, Min? I was totally freaked. I blurted, nothing. Hearing his voice so calm, so cold, it was instant terror, like being assaulted all over again. I hung up. George was arrested on a charge of domestic assault. At a preliminary hearing, the judge issued a temporary protection order. He was to have, quote, no contact directly or indirectly, in person, in writing, or by phone, personally or through other persons, with Mindy Charlie. The physical harm George inflicted on Mindy resulted in a diagnosis of multiple contusions and a hairline fractured vertebra on her neck. Despite the court order, George returned to Mindy's apartment at 2 a.m. when she wasn't home. Her roommate Terry told him to leave. He reminded her that his name was not on the lease. She asked him, What did you do to our place? What did you do to Mindy? He said, Mindy did that to herself, hun. He pointed out to Terry that he didn't damage any of her belongings. George contacted Mindy and tried to get back together with her. There was no real apology. He just downplayed what he had done to her. Ultimately, he was difficult to forgive. It was months before the pain in her neck was alleviated. Glendon Booth figured it was a matter of time before George Russell's prowling would manifest as something much worse than breaking into women's homes and watching them as a shadow from a distance. To quote Booth, through that whole rainy spring, a guy'd been slipping into bedrooms, standing next to women, stealing mementos. It didn't take a genius to figure who it was. George was living on the east side, but he was acting up on the Mercer Island at night. The risk was low. Even when we popped him, he never served more than a few days. Usually his victims couldn't identify him, or wouldn't. Nobody wanted to be accused of race prejudice. George knew how to make you feel guilty, make you feel like a racist. He enjoyed his cat and mouse games. We wanted to bust his ass for good. Burglars sometimes break into houses for sexual gratification, stuff panties in their mouths, crawl through a bedroom on their hands and knees. George was sneaking in and out, using his pen light, feeling his power. Sometimes a woman would see a shadow, hear him go out the door or window. Sometimes they wouldn't even know he'd been there till they noticed something missing. Sitting in the station that morning, working on my second cup of coffee, I thought back on his record. It seemed like he'd spent half his adult life in King County Jail, ranging from a few days for trespassing to a year for felony escape. His juvenile record wasn't much better. God knows how many contacts we'd had with him and how many times he'd been suspected of crime. I had my own theory on what was happening to George. He used to be a young, handsome, articulate kid, a pretty boy, Then he turned 18, and all his friends were gone. The bottom dropped out of his life, and he couldn't adjust. And every year it just got worse. There was family friction, and there were other negative factors, like the way he tried to out-white Whitey instead of being proud of what he was. Black pride, that's a damn good concept, but what he had was black shame. So he turns in on himself, and pretty soon he's a grown man with a 14-year-old mentality. He was getting flushed down the toilet with age, was losing his ability to seduce young girls, hanging out in joints that he couldn't afford. He'd spent a lifetime using people, and now people were using him. He's putting the make on these good-looking girls, and they're saying, "Hey, Honey Bear, how about another round?" But when the bar closed, he wasn't Honey Bear anymore. He was plain old George, a black guy who talked like a white, and he'd take the bus back to Mercer Island alone. The next thing we knew, we'd get a call about a prowler. I took a look at the latest arrest report. Same old shit. Early in the morning, this couple woke up and saw a dark shadow in their bedroom. Then it was gone. An hour later, a citizen spotted him, prowling cars on 72nd. A canine dog named Casey pinned him down in somebody's garage after he outran 2 officers. As usual, there wasn't enough evidence for a felony charge. George knew our statutes. He'd been studying police procedures since he was shorter than his St. Bernard. The complainants couldn't make a positive ID. It was a typical George Russell situation. We're a day late and $1 short. I peeked in his cell. He was beginning to look like a beaten-down old inmate. Haggard, dirty. The jailhouse pallor was on his face, sunken cheeks, a burnt-out look. I thought, Georgie, what the hell's happened to you? Don't get me wrong, I didn't feel sympathy. He wanted to make an ass out of every cop in town. I didn't have a shred of feeling left for the guy. Our graveyard officers had been chasing him all night, and now he had to be arraigned. I thought, here we go again. He'll end up serving a few days and be right back in somebody's bedroom. I sat him down for a talk, deadly serious. I flat told him he was going to end up killing somebody. I said, you go in these houses, George, laying next to these women. What are you doing? Jacking off on the floor? George always smiles and denies, but this time he was hard. He said, you don't have shit on me. You're trying to dump on me. Well, I talked to my lawyer, and there isn't a damn thing you can do. I told him I was going to ask our district judge to pull his probation. Suzanne, he says, she's going to be highly upset that you're doing this. He always acted as if our judges were old friends. Personally, I thought Judge Staples was always too lax on him. I brought him into court in handcuffs and manacles and left them on. It was 10 a.m., March 21st, 1990. George was 6 weeks short of 32. His clothes were torn, and he was dirty. I wanted the judge to see him for what he was, a hardened criminal. No more of this smiling and making cracks and calling judges by their first names. He was arraigned on charges of criminal trespass, obstruction of justice, and an outstanding $1,000 warrant. And of course he had a story. He said he'd been on his way to visit a friend at 5 a.m. He admitted he'd been using his pen light, but only to keep from being hit by cars as he walked. He admitted he ran, but not to escape arrest. He said he thought Patrolman Kettles was chasing him, and Tom had been persecuting him for a long time, etc., etc. The same old bullshit. If you knew George, you could recite his alibi before he opened his mouth. The judge threw out the obstruction charge on a technicality, something to the effect that the officers had hollered, "Hey!" instead of calling him by name. She said she didn't agree that George was a danger to the community. I reminded her that he was a well-known burglar with years of criminal history. I said, at least twice we've caught him with butcher knives hidden in his shirt sleeves. You mean to tell me he isn't dangerous? I said, look at the trouble he causes our department. Up all night, chasing him all over the island. I admit I was pissed off. All the years of aggravation. After a while, she told me I was out of order. I got in her face again, and it turned pretty hot. She'd never thought much of us cops anyway, treated us like janitors. George served 4 days. A former friend noted that among George's fetishes was a proclivity for vampiric activity. On one occasion, George and a woman cut each other on their necks with a razor blade and sucked the other's blood. George was no longer content to brandish knives as weapons. He purchased a gun. He and his friend Mike Weisenberg shared an enthusiasm for guns, both having been born in the Deep South. As Mike put it, all us Georgians love guns. That Beretta was a beautiful piece, fit right into your hand. George and me acted like kids about our guns. Didn't know any better. We went over to the Bellevue Park and ride with 2 girls and popped some rounds at glass jugs. George wasn't a very good shot. Later I chilled out and stopped carrying mine. I realized it was no damn toy. George was later charged with possession of stolen property when he was searched by a police officer, and the serial number of the gun linked it to another owner. June 22nd, 1990. George Russell borrowed a pickup truck from his friend Smitty. June 23rd, 2 a.m. A condo resident heard a woman yell, "Somebody help me! You're hurting me! Stop it! Stop it! You'll kill me!" In response, a male voice shouted, "Were you fucking him? Were you fucking him?" Though George told Smitty he would only need it for an hour or so, he didn't return it until well after midnight. There was a reddish-orangish stain on the passenger seat. He claimed it was vomit from a girl who had been eating clam chowder. 7 a.m. A maintenance worker employed by a McDonald's restaurant was sweeping up outdoors. He checked to see if garbage from McDonald's had blown onto the Black Angus property overnight. He took a look at a dumpster whilst engaging in this activity. He saw something curious in the dumpster. Upon closer inspection, it was a body, unconscious, naked, female, and supine. Detective Marvin Skeen recalls the state of the body. Somebody had taken pains posing her. I'd seen bodies torn apart by animals, a naked body in a tanning booth, a couple of skeletons, a lawyer murdered in his office, all shapes and sizes. But this was the first time I'd ever seen a body that was obviously posed. Her left foot was crossed over her right ankle. Her hands were crossed on her stomach, left over her right. A fur cone was tucked under her hands. Her head was turned a little to the left, and a white plastic lid from a Frito-Lay dip container covered her right eye. All she wore was a gold choker with a crescent-shaped white pendant and a gold watch with clear stones around the face. Right next to the body was a little pile of debris, as though somebody had swept up but hadn't collected it yet. I figured that was probably where the plastic lid originated. 2 brooms were leaning against the wall. Till you got real close, she looked like a young girl. She was about 5'8", maybe 150 pounds, white, curly light brown hair with a reddish tint, medium length. Her nail polish was shocking pink. She didn't look real beat up, just a little blood on her face and abrasions on her right arm and breast, both hips, knees, and feet. There were some scratches on her neck, probably from her own nails, where she tried to get her fingers under the necklace as the guy tried to strangle her. Her face was a little off center from being hit, and blood had seeped from a head wound. She looked like she'd been in a minor traffic accident. There was no ID, no clothing, no rings or bracelets with name or initials, no hint of who she was. My first feelings were a little confused. In some weird way, it looked like the killer cared about this woman. He was mocking the cops, maybe, laughing at us, but he also had feelings about the victim. The posing seemed like a statement against females in general. In your eye. Degrading, violent, but there was a restfulness to it. I thought, maybe he felt sorry for her after he killed her, and that's why he laid her out so carefully. It was almost like looking at a body in a coffin. He wanted her to be found. The feeling I got was the guy was sending a message, but what the hell was it? I realized that this was going to be a hard one. I made a WAG, wild-ass guess, that she'd been dragged around the dumpster area, not just dropped there. That would explain the abrasions. It wasn't even a swag, a scientific wild-ass guess. While I was waiting for the crime scene investigation van and the medical examiner, I walked around the parking lot, sticking surveyor's tape on anything that looked significant. An earring, a disposable diaper, a silver chain and cross, a beer bottle, some beauty bark, other stuff. Nothing I tagged turned out to be relevant. We ran the license plates of a couple of parked cars. They weren't relevant either. They were left by people who had been too drunk to drive home the night before. The ME said he'd never seen a victim posed like that. He measured the body core temp at 83, placed the time of death at 2:20 a.m. to 5:20 a.m. After they took her away, I saw dark red stains at the opening to the industrial trash compactor. A presumptive test for blood was positive. When Smitty finally got his truck back, he was horrified by the stench he encountered when he stepped inside. As he tells it, "When I had been hunting before, you can remember vividly when you cut open an animal, what it smells like. Beyond vomit. Smell-wise, it was the most violent vomit I had ever smelled. If that, it was beyond awful. It was all over the interior of the truck. All over. I also smelled a faint smell of, like a lemon-scented Lysol, as if someone had tried to clean it up or cover the smell. The smell was so nauseating it triggered Smitty's gag reflex. George called Smitty at 11 a.m. to ask him if he wanted to go shopping. Smitty demanded to know what happened in his truck hours before. George said he met a girl who drove a Porsche, but for some reason he didn't want to be seen in such a high-end car, so he took her for a ride in Smitty's truck. As for the smell, he claimed he was too nervous and drunk and vomited. He said that after missing him at Denny's, he spent the rest of the night looking for Smitty. There was nothing about this story that made sense, and the incident was a critical blemish on their friendship. Speaking of blemishes, Smitty's efforts in cleaning his truck required more than the usual amount of elbow grease, since the reddish stain kept reappearing after he washed it. When Mindy Charlie was informed of the murder, she had her own suspicions about the identity of the perpetrator. She said, "It's George." She began to cry. Her friend Mark said, "No." Mindy could not be budged from this position. She reiterated, "It's George. I know it is. He hates women. He hates the Angus." George had been banned from the Angus due to criminal activity, like drug trafficking. Mindy went on. "He knew we were getting together here last night with Tammy and Mike and Robbie, Bob, and the others. Mark, it's too obvious." Mark said, "What was his motive?" She said, "Whoever knows George's motive. Maybe he just wanted to shut them down for 86ing him. George isn't getting his way with women anymore, Mark. Somebody said another girlfriend just dumped him. He used to push us around. Now he's the one being pushed. George doesn't like that. Look what he did to me." Mark felt that to assume George was capable of murder was overreaching. Mindy said, "I've seen a look in his eyes. when George goes off, he's capable of anything. Mark still felt she was jumping to conclusions. Mindy said, "I pray to God I am." The victim went unidentified for some time. In the meantime, an autopsy was performed, which produced the following findings. Signs of strangulation, a lacerated nose, facial contusions, deep fractures of the skull, a split liver, contusions and abrasions on both breasts, ragged tears in the anus made by a foreign object, rough and injurious penetration of the vagina, sperm found in the vaginal vault, throttled with her own choker, dirt and other natural detritus indicating the attack occurred outdoors. The attack may have occurred over a span of 3 to 4 hours. The anal and vaginal rape were carried out after the victim perished. The culprit was likely a sadistic necrophile. At George Russell's new favorite watering hole, Papagayo's Cantina, he was questioned about the murder after having been shown a photograph of the victim. Investigator Earl Barnes recounted how George conducted himself during questioning. Then the way he spoke and that skinny little head reminded me, hey, that's the guy I used to play basketball with on Mercer Island. Of course, George remembered me. There's only 5 or 6 black officers in Bellevue. Whenever Jeff and I walked in, he'd say, so-and-so's here tonight, and he might be worth taking a look at. And so-and-so's sitting over there, blah, blah, blah. We showed him the photos of the victim, and he didn't recognize her. Then he changed his mind and said, yeah, I think I know her. She might have come over to our table that night. I might have talked to her. She was wearing, blah, blah, blah. Looks like the same kind of buttons. He brought some guys over to look at the picture. He tried to buy us beers, and we said no. He kept pumping us for information. How close are you to making an arrest? What are you holding back? After a while, he became a pain, a typical wannabe. They mean well, but they just gum up an investigation. One of Barnes's colleagues advised him to take George's words with a grain of salt. Marianne Polreich was identified as the murder victim. Investigator Dale Foote was dispatched to a private residence where a suicide had been reported. He recounted his findings. When I got there, Lieutenant Dave Morrison came up to my car and said, "This is a homicide, Dale. This woman didn't kill herself. You'll see when you get inside." I thought, well, if it's a murder, it's my turn in the barrel. We walked past a man and 2 young girls, the ex-husband and 2 daughters. He wasn't living there anymore and had working casts on both arms after a fall on the job. Everybody was crying, comforting, and hugging each other. Officer Mike Elliott took me to the bedroom door. I stepped inside and stopped short. There was blood on the floor. A dock radio played softly. I saw a small color TV on a dresser. A naked body lay diagonally on a king-size bed. I took a closer look and went numb. No way in this world I expected to walk in on something like that, now or ever. There's a million ways to kill somebody, but to do to a body what he'd done, I couldn't make sense of it. I almost went into shock. I figured the best thing I could do was just stand around for a few seconds and take my mind out of gear. Then I took a deep breath and looked back. The woman's crotch faced the bedroom door. Her legs were spread and bent at the knees, almost touching at the heels. I thought, no way this positioning is accidental. The killer wanted you to walk in and be hit with the sight. A shotgun barrel was inserted into her body. I'm thinking, my God, did he pull the trigger? What would a shotgun do if it were fired inside a woman? What am I supposed to see here? I'm looking for her insides everywhere. But then I'm thinking, hey, there's just a few blood smears on the walls and ceiling, so I realized the gun hadn't been fired. It was a prop. The guy had bunched up the covers and rested the gun butt on them so that the barrel went straight into her vagina. No angle. She had on red high heels, nothing else. A teddy nightgown with spaghetti straps was laid out nice and neat. Looked like he intended to dress the body, but changed his mind. Her panties were bunched up to one side, and her head was covered by a large blue pillow. I figured it was to hide her face, or to suffocate her, or to quiet her death rattles, which could have gone on for a long time while he was doing his thing. I saw all this in seconds. Then I backed out of the house and told her shift supervisor, Lieutenant Ed Mott, "Round up the troops. We need everybody out here." He called in the whole detective division, crime lab equipment, the medical examiner. We started making assignments, got a search warrant for the house over the phone, called the prosecutor and told him what we had. I started the on-scene investigation. One of the patrol officers told me that the woman was Carol Beath. Her daughter Kelly had gotten up around 8:30 and found the door to her mother's bedroom closed and locked, which surprised her because it was never locked. She went outside to the sliding glass door and found it open. She looked inside and saw her mother on the bed. She went to the phone and called her dad, Paul Beath, a few miles away. He got there in 10 minutes and took a quick look and figured she'd killed herself. He called us to report the suicide. Paul said he'd talked to Carol on the phone the night before and she hadn't sounded depressed or upset. She had a good job, her bills were paid, and she was looking forward to a 3-week scuba diving trip to the Caribbean with her boyfriend, Tom Jones. Officer Steve Cercone advised me that one of the daughters had seen something suspicious during the night. I isolated the 2 kids in a neighbor's house. I thought, what an awful thing to have to do. Their worlds just collapsed, and I've got to ask them a bunch of questions about their dead mom. Jamie was 9. She was crying. You could see this was over her head. The older sister, Kelly, was 13. She sounded calm and controlled. I figured it was from shock. "Kelly," I said, "I want you to tell me what happened right from the beginning." She was amazing. She was old enough and smart enough to know that her mom and dad had some problems, and her mom's lifestyle wasn't like a lot of other moms. We talked in the house, and then we took a little walk together on the sidewalk. She said she'd been awake in her room about 4:30 when she heard someone walking along the hallway. She raised up on one elbow and looked out the door from her top bunk and saw the silhouette of a man holding a flashlight with a yellowish beam. She figured it was her mother's boyfriend, Tom Jones. She knew that her mom was also seeing a guy who worked at the Factoria Keg and another guy named Dave, but Jones was the only person who entered the house late at night. He was about the right size, slender, maybe 5'10". Kelly said the boyfriend poked the light in each room. She looked out the window for Jones's Corvette and didn't see it. She called out, "Mom?" but there was no answer. Kelly was real tired. She'd been up late talking to her own boyfriend through the window. She said she fell back to sleep and didn't get up till she found her mother's body. After we talked, I had the feeling she was traumatized and holding out, unintentionally. I felt that in such a small house, she'd heard more than she was telling me. I had a feeling she was suppressing something, and when she's 40 or 50 years old, she's going to be sitting down with some counselor, and she'll remember more. I think her main thought in the middle of the night was, "Whoever's with my mom, it's okay. It's probably Tom. Nothing new." Her mother was free and easy about sex. It was her lifestyle and her choice. The victim was identified by police as Carol Beath officially. Her head had been wrapped in several layers of dry cleaner plastic. She had been struck repeatedly on the left side of her head. The weapon used to strike her sliced her left ear and cut 13 Y-shaped wounds. Defensive wounds were detected, suggesting that though she was dispatched quickly, but not instantaneously, one of her little fingers was nearly severed. There was a large purplish bruise on her left bicep in the shape of human teeth. Blood smears were found on her body, the bed, the floor. More blood was spattered on the walls and ceiling. Foote was convinced she was attacked in her sleep. The autopsy revealed that 2 of the ribs on her left side were broken and pushed into the chest cavity. There was deep bruising on the right side. She was violated with a gun after death. Foote concluded that the attacker was in a rage at the time. The gun was left inside her. It was a shotgun. Commenting on the perpetrator as he saw him, Foote said, "To me, he wasn't like a psychotic who's going to dismember the body and do some crazy thing. He wasn't just some nut. This killing took thought, imagination, improvisation. He spent a long time and gave the scene a lot of attention. He was a guy who did things a certain way, just right. No, the word crazy never came to my mind. The word for this was evil." George was remembered by his friends as having become obsessed with the 2 murders. As Susie Jetley put it, all summer long he'd been jabbering about the murders, giving the impression he had the inside track. Whenever he walked in the house, he'd start in again, laying out the newspaper articles and talking about the stupid cops. He'd worked out some kind of anagram with the victims' initials, made a connection between these killings and some killings in California, or maybe with the Bundy killings. I'm not sure. I heard him explaining, but it sounded like his typical bullshit. He still dropped big hints about Damien. Our Damien. He would borrow Damien's long trench coat and wear it for days, and then hint that Damien was involved in the killings. He showed us pictures of the dead women that he'd cut out of the papers, and he said, "Listen to me, guys. One man killed them both." He had another major theme, that the dead girls were skanky sluts. They used men, and he had no sympathy for whores like that. He said they dumped men and deserved what they got. He said that his girlfriend Mindy once brought home a man when she and George were living together. He spoke poorly of her and said she'd tried to beat him up. He said whenever they'd get in a fight, she'd dress up fit to kill and prowl the nightclubs to make him jealous. I wondered if that was what made him so angry at women. It had to be something. September 3rd, 11:30 a.m. Firefighter Bob Hayes of the Bellevue Fire Department placed a call to 911 about the tenant who lived in his basement, a woman named Andrea Levine. Operator, what are you reporting? Hayes, fatality. Operator, a what? Hayes, murder. Operator, a murder? Hayes, I believe so. We've got a tenant in our basement, and I just found her body. Operator, okay, let me transfer you over to the medics. Just a moment. The body was posed as if being prepared for a magazine spread. She was left underneath a white comforter with reddish-green stripes. She was naked and spread-eagled diagonally. One arm was placed on a blue pillow. A portion of her brain protruded from a wound. A white plastic vibrator was jammed in her mouth. A copy of the book More Joy of Sex, a lovemaking companion to the joy of sex, was left underneath her left forearm. Her entire body, from her scalp to the soles of her feet, was punctured with small, neatly proportioned stab wounds. To experts examining the body, it appeared that they were most likely made post-mortem, a practice known as picarism. It was as if the assailant were cutting a tapestry in accordance with his own morbid aesthetic sensibility. A crosshatch formation was cut on the right breast, with the implications being that the murderer was playing a solo game of tic-tac-toe. Some straight lines were cut. Some were cut in patterns. Either way, it appeared that the killer took an artistic approach to the murder. On her thigh, just beneath her vagina, The rough outline of a hand was cut into her flesh with 18 to 20 cuts. A circular picor, as it was called, was cut into her flesh on the other thigh. Picorism is a sexual fetish involving the penetration of a person with sharp objects. It dovetails with sadism. In its most extreme form, it can result in serious injury and/or death. Minuscule spots of blood were observed around the room, suggesting that as the victim was struck, a mist of blood saturated the air as the murder weapon was wielded. There were dried fluid stains on the floor that suggested dried semen. A swatch containing these stains was cut out for forensic analysis. The vibrator and a baseball bat were collected and taken to the lab. An evidence technician opined that the perpetrator must have wiped down the room extensively. They were not dealing with an amateur with no foresight and impulse control. It seemed as though this person knew what the police would be looking for. The guilty party must have studied law enforcement to some degree. The weapons used to assault and kill the victim, aside from the vibrator, were not left behind. Detective Larry Peterson had some background in criminal behavior profiling. He shared one theory about the mentality of the murderer. We're not dealing with somebody who's just killing for the hell of it. He's venting a frustration. Find the frustration, find the killer. Findings from the autopsy. She was the victim of a so-called blitz attack. Her death was caused by blunt impact injuries to the head and fractures to the vault and base of her skull. There were 3 long scratches on her back made either with a knife or fingernails. 3 stab wounds in her anal cavity. 231 picor wounds, including 7 on the sole of the right foot and 9 on the left. George Russell became a suspect in the 3 murders. The killings took place late at night, and George had been a reputed prowler, even if he hadn't always been caught, and there wasn't always enough evidence to arrest him. Detective Mike Bechtold had witnessed George Russell escort a staggering woman across a Papagayo's parking lot. He didn't think anything of it at the time. Drunk people light on their feet weren't exactly a rarity at that time and place. He didn't give much thought to the young man named Smitty, whose truck had been borrowed by Russell for a length of time that far exceeded the agreed-upon allotment. Now he began to make some new connections with this data. Bechtold commented on this new development. I was very removed from the murder cases, talking to kids about drugs and stuff, setting up sports events, making speeches, my usual job. Right after the Maple Valley meeting, Marv Skeen came up to me and said, "Hey Mike, we're looking at an old friend of yours in the murders." I asked who. He said, "George Russell." My whole brain lit up. I went, holy shit. I tried to collect my thoughts. "Marv," I said, "did you know George left Papagayo's that night with a woman?" He said, "No." "Yeah, in somebody's truck. He didn't bring it back at closing time. I helped the owner look for it." "We need that truck." Marv said, "What was the guy's name?" I couldn't remember. I said, "I don't know if I ever knew his name. Give me some time." I went into my office and thought and finally wrote out a report. I still couldn't remember that name. When 16-year-old Nicole DeVita was locked out of her family's apartment, she tried to wake her brother by throwing objects at his bedroom window. No dice. After this failed, a black male emerged from the shadows. He said, "Oh, Tony's your brother?" However well he may have been acquainted with her brother, he was a stranger to Nicole. He checked all the windows for her and confirmed that they were indeed locked. When Nicole began her ascent up the privacy fence to the patio, she was thrown to the ground. When she looked up, the man was lifting a large rock. He pounded her head, knocking her flat to the ground. She shouted, "Stop it! Stop it!" He struck her with the rock several more times. Having finished with that, he dragged her across the lawn as she screamed. Her family began turning on their lights as they investigated the commotion. She heard the assailant grunting as she fainted. She woke 10 hours later in the intensive care unit of a hospital in Seattle. Diagnostic examination revealed a depressed skull fracture, a concussion, and deep scratches on her scalp, neck, and hands. She was informed that her father and a family friend chased the man away. She gave the following description of the man to police. Mixed black, not completely black. Looked like he had a mix of possibly East Indian in him. Late 20s in age, about 5'9". Scrawny build, not bony, but skinny. Had real frizzy, approximately 2-inch long hair, that of a black but somewhat straightened out like an East Indian's, and that looked odd. Wearing baggy, very loose clothes in dark colors, baggy pants, and a windbreaker-type coat that was somewhat long in length. Tammy Grace, a former love interest of George Russell, had long ago lost interest in him, especially when he began prowling her at her condo to the point of stalking. She commented on her role in the investigation. All of a sudden, I've got cops swarming all over, wanting to know about George. In little ways, they were confirming that he was trying to kill me. Detective Buckland hinted that I was the link between George and some murders. And now Detective Dingfield is telling me that when George looked in that window and saw my blonde roommate from the back, he must have thought it was me, and that's why he kept trying to get in the doors and windows. I asked, why on earth would George do a stupid thing like that? Dingfield said, from what we know about him, he'd do it for the challenge. If he shows up again, call 911. I said, that's what I did the last time. He intercepts radio calls on his scanner. You'll never catch him that way. Detective Dingfield gave me his private phone number and told me to call him direct. When he finally left, I was so scared I called Mike, and he and Robbie Bob rushed over to protect me. They helped calm me down, but not much. Tammy's paranoia soon led to panic as George began to come around again. As she tells it, I'd read an article in the Seattle Times, 3 murders worry the East Side. It advised women to, quote, use common sense in dealing with strangers. Good advice, but what about dealing with a guy that tries to break in your place and the cops already suspect him of murder? Around 11 o'clock, I was alone when somebody knocked on my bedroom window. It was insistent. Dum-da-da-dum-dum, dum-da-dum-dum. I knew our house noises, and this was not a cat or a raccoon or a tree branch. At first I thought one of my friends forgot something and came back. But then I thought, my friends all know what's going on. They'd never scare me like this. I turned off the light, crawled to the corner and dialed 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line till 2 cops arrived. First, they checked every door and window from the outside. Then the one named Yamamoto came in and said, okay, show me where he knocked. As I started toward my bedroom, he veered off toward the back door. I said, where are you going? The knock was on my bedroom window. The cop said, do you realize the screen on your sliding glass door is off its channel? I said, what? He took me back and showed me. Someone had tried to pry off the screen. I started to tell him about the first break-in, but just then my roommates came home and Lori said that George was out front with a girl in a red Volkswagen Bug. I went, oh my God. I told the cop, that's the guy who tried to break in. Yamamoto ran out the front door. I called after him. Don't leave me. Call Detective Dingfield. Here's his private number. There's more to this than you realize. I was convinced George would talk his way out of being arrested and come back and kill me with the same knife he'd used on Mindy's tires. The officer went out to the parking lot and told George I was accusing him of breaking in. Naturally, George had an excuse ready. He said, I live right here. I have witnesses. We were just going to Denny's for coffee. He bluffed it out the way he always did, gave him the old BS. I was with my roommates, they'll vouch for me, and one of them did. Jenny Graves told the cops he'd been gone from the condo for hours. How could he have prowled anybody? Yamamoto comes back in my place and says, "Mr. Russell didn't even know you lived here, ma'am, and he's been gone most of the evening." I'm in a panic. I said, "What are you doing? If you don't arrest him now, what's to stop him from coming back to hurt me?" I could have cried. I shut my door and turned off my lights and just sat paralyzed in my room. I asked God to please not let me be killed. Outside in the parking lot, Patrolman Thomas Baker informed Patrolman Satoshi Yamamoto that outstanding warrants were in effect for the arrest of George Russell. Russell was arrested that very night. 2 of the warrants had been issued in Seattle for his misadventures in the Pike Place Market District. There were also 2 no-bail commitment orders for criminal trespass on Mercer Island. He was taken into custody without incident. George Russell was interrogated by Dale Foote. Foote commented on Russell's disposition during the interview. George was very collected. You could see this was old stuff to him. He seemed concerned about projecting the right image. He's cool, you're uncool. He was respectful within that need. I was glad that he agreed to talk, but I didn't get much out of him. George acknowledged having been banned from the Black Angus by a waitress known as GB. He said he was loosely associated with Randy Levine and Marianne Polreich. He said he never met Carol Beef. George Russell was on thin ice, but he was skating in circles, with Dale Foote gaining no ground. Detective Marvin Skeen recognized it was time to shift gears. Otherwise, there was a good chance that George Russell was going to walk. With the media having declared that a serial killer was on the loose, thousands of people were on edge, and they placed an enormous amount of pressure on local law enforcement officials. In such circumstances, they are usually accused of dragging their feet, which is seldom the case. With the burden of proof being paramount, they must be very careful about who they approach and how. Skeen described how they advanced their investigation to a second interview with George Russell. Larry and I took him into an interview room, and I started him out with a list of 14 standard questions I'd asked every suspect in the Polreich case. It's a system developed by the Reed School of Criminology in Chicago. "We're investigating a homicide," I said. "I figured that. Were you the one who killed her?" "No, I was not. I did not kill her, any of them." "Do you think she was raped and killed?" "Who? The paper never said." "Why do you think someone would kill her?" "They said she wasn't into drugs, even though I told Detective Barnes different. Someone in the past may not have liked her." "Did you ever think about killing someone, even though you didn't go through with it?" "I'm sure everyone has, right? Everyone says at some time, 'I want to kill you,' maybe in a fight or something." "Have you ever been in a situation where you lost control?" "Anger-wise, maybe with my girlfriend. I wrecked a bunch of stuff." "Tell me what you were doing Friday night, June 22nd. "Generally, every Friday since Papagayo's opened, I play chess at the Crossroads Mall. There's this big chess set there. I leave home, play chess, arrive early, get a table. I eat first. They bring my drink, a shot of tequila, and a Miller Lite. Right over." He tried to give me the impression that he was having an easy time, but his body language told us different. He's sitting in his chair, feet firmly planted, body rigid, face and facial expressions flexible. It's yeah, and I know this. I know that, but his body isn't telling the same smooth story. One of the officers who saw him earlier had told us he was handing out a line of jive when he came in. "Gee, guys, I really don't know what you're talking about. I'd sure like to help you. if there's ever anything I can do. He didn't try that crap on Larry and me. After I finished my canned questions, we let him think about it for 5 or 10 minutes, and then resumed. He told us quite a lot about Randy Levine, how her truck had broken down, and he helped her, how he'd seen her recently at a party at Papa Gale's, how he'd stopped by her house one night, and she invited him to go to dinner, but he declined. He said he learned about her murder in the paper. He told us about a night he got drunk at Houlihan's, and there was a big argument between Robbie Bob de Zurich and a guy named Mike Weisenberg about who would take her home. It was like he was creating other suspects to divert our attention, an old story with criminals. Most of them roll over on their mothers. He told us that he knew dozens of police officers. He'd worked at the Mercer Island PD. His mom taught at San Francisco State, and his natural father was half British and half black, and his stepdad was a dentist, just a good kid from good stock. It was part of his image, his coolness. We finally tiptoed back to the murders, and he said he'd met Marianne at Papa Gale's, but she wasn't his type. Too tall, too heavy. The night she disappeared, his friend Alan Israel was with him, and so was a guy named Smitty. He said they went to Papa Gale's in Smitty's truck, and he borrowed the truck just before closing time to go to a 7-Eleven for beer. He visited a female friend, but she didn't answer his knock. He was gone about 45 minutes and missed connections with Smitty when he brought back the truck. He was still doing a lot of nervous giggling. I remembered what Mike Bechtold said about Russell borrowing somebody's truck and disappearing with a woman, but Mike still hadn't come up with the owner's name. I'm thinking, if that truck was used in the murder, we might find some hard evidence in it. I asked, what's the rest of Smitty's name? Russell didn't hesitate. He told me it was Smith McLean and gave his address and phone number on Mercer Island. I thought, this guy's pretty cocky, like he knows we're not going to get anything off the truck. But we're going to check it out anyway. He'd already said he'd be willing to take a polygraph. Now I asked if he'd be willing to give us samples of his blood, saliva, and hair. Bang. His whole attitude changed. He jumped up like he was ejected, crossed his arms over his chest, and said, shouldn't there be somebody else in this room? I said, you're talking about your attorney? He said, yeah. He didn't sound friendly anymore. You want an attorney? Yeah. It was 8:37. We'd talked for over an hour. It took a while to make the phone connection, and then the lawyer said no more talking and no tests. I got George some breakfast and took him back to the holding cell. I said to myself, maybe he killed Carol. Maybe he didn't, but he sure looks good for the other two. An innocent man might have hemmed and hawed about the tests, might have said something like, do you really need samples? But George, levitated out of that chair. It was like, you want war? Okay, man, you got war. Jeff Gomez came in. He'd introduced me to Russell at Papa Gale's, and I told him George could be our man. Those big brown eyes almost popped out of his head. He said, oh no, not skinny George. Later we viewed some of the film that Dale Foote had shot from Papa Gale's catwalk, and there was George in the middle of the frame. I thought, yeah, it might be skinny George, but how do we get the evidence? The detectives interviewed Captain Mike Knoll of the King County Police and other staff involved in the investigation to draw up a list of common denominators in the 3 murders. The list was comprised of the following. All the victims' faces were covered. All were abused by a foreign object. All were killed by blunt trauma. All were nude and posed on their backs. All had been in a bar not long before death. All were Crossroads Mall habitués. All were sexually active Caucasians. Clothes were completely or partly missing. Rings had been taken from at least 2. An expert on sex crimes took a look at the available evidence and concluded that the murders were committed by one culprit. He was certain that the assailant was motivated by misogynistic rage and that his victims were facing consequences for another woman's misdeeds. The police decided to conduct a thorough examination of Smitty's truck for evidence. Smitty had had it cleaned about 4 times since he loaned it to George, but the police decided it couldn't hurt to search for anything he might have missed. Sure enough, there were stains found on the gauze backing on the driver's side. Another stain was discovered on the foam underneath. When they were analyzed in the state crime lab, they were found to be matching blood samples for that of Marianne Polreich, since it was type A blood. The problem was, 40% of the population is type A. The genetic blueprinting was the only way to prove it was Marianne's blood, and that process would take a very long time. There were some blood, semen, and hair samples found on the victim that was proven to have originated in an African American, but this was not sufficient as evidence. Coming up with evidence amid all this was tough. No prosecutor would be convinced to move ahead with charges. Detective Skeen presented his argument for why George Russell should be charged with the murder of Marianne Polreich. George convinces Marianne to join him in Smitty's truck for a drink of Rumpel Minz. He wants sex, and we know from her personality she would resist. He loses his temper and kills her. Now he has a big problem, a dead body in the truck. George is a thinker, and he still remembers being 86'd by G.B. Coffin, so he offloads the body behind the Black Angus and makes sure it gets maximum media attention by posing her as though she's in her coffin. Coffin, get it? That's the way his brain works. Stupid clues for stupid cops. The whole East Side starts buzzing about this killing, just the kind of attention George wanted. He's always talked and read about the Hillside Stranglers and John Wayne Gacy and Bundy and the lack of black serial murderers. But before he can get to his real target, which is GB, she skips. He starts thinking, well, what about a substitute? What about a friend? That's when he murders Carol Beath in her sleep. He'd already been burglarizing her place at night. Then he sets up an alibi with 5 or 6 kids in his motel room and sneaks out and blitzes Randy Levine the same way, asleep and helpless. She'd rebuffed him twice, and he had some kind of goofy idea that she was cheating on one of his friends. That was more than enough to set him off. For several weeks, somebody'd been prowling Randy's apartment at night. It was George. Who else? The prosecuting attorney saw the validity of this reasoning, and he brought charges of first-degree murder against George Russell the day before Russell would have been released from King County Jail. That day, George Russell entered an innocent plea. Ed Polreich, Marianne's brother, attended the hearing and said to a journalist, "I wanted to see what the guy looks like. Nothing's going to bring my sister back. I still can't comprehend it. She wasn't just a sister, she was a friend." Ed held his infant son aloft. "Here's our beautiful little baby she never got to see. She loved kids." After vowing that his family would attend every court date, he said, "I want him to see how much we hurt." More evidence was gathered, and George Russell was charged with the murders of Carol Beath and Andrea Levine. The prosecutors declared that they would seek life imprisonment. Russell was held on $500,000 bail. His family did not provide him with an attorney, so he was represented by a public defender. September 13th, 1991. George Russell's murder trial commenced. The attorneys squabbled over morbid, bizarre, and gruesome details. In fact, court reporter William Kramer characterized it as, quote, "the most gruesome trial I've seen in 21 years. Witness Jenny Graves testified regarding George Russell's relations with and feelings about Andrea Levine, and her words would prove to be damaging to his defense. From her testimony, he didn't talk about her in a good way. He told me how she was going out with one guy and sleeping with another guy who was friends with the one guy, how he thought that was a terrible thing to do, kind of. Susan Jetley also recalled some dark forebodings in statements George Russell made about Andrea Levine. Andrea Levine had dated a friend of his. He had some pretty cruel things to say about her. He said she slept around, she was a whore, she used men. She went on to say that she remembered him saying those things more than once. She also recalled him saying that the police were stupid and that the victims, quote, were all promiscuous, that they were sluts, that they used men. Other witnesses were called forth to testify for and against George Russell, defending his character or revealing its more unsavory aspects. There were no real triumphs for either side. Russell chose not to testify. Prosecuting attorney Jeffrey Baird sold the jury on his argument for George Russell's guilt with the following statement after pointing to photographs of the three victims. Mary Polreich, Carol Beath, Randy Levine. This is the way they looked when they were alive. This is not the way they will be remembered. We will find ourselves for a long, long time to come at inopportune and unexpected moments, remembering them the way Mr. Russell intended us to remember them. He made caricatures of them. He made cartoons, grotesque, obscene, cruel, and unforgettable. This is the creative work of George Waterfield Russell. I'm going to talk today about Mr. Russell's work, about the themes we see in his work, about the materials he used, the terms he used, the tools he employed, the gloves he used, and the paint he had to work with. I'm going to talk about the little pieces of himself that Mr. Russell left accidentally in his work. I'm going to talk about the little pieces of each victim, a poster, a couple of rings that Mr. Russell took with him and passed around like prizes. I'm sure Mr. Russell himself is flattered by this analogy to the artist. The personal self-expression that is evident in his work, the fine detail work visible even on the soles of Randy Levine's feet, the broad sweeping strokes that he used on Carol Beath's head, and the satisfying subtle character sketch of posing Mary Polreich, her battered body, in a position of repose. In this argument, I'm going to suggest that Mr. Russell's signature, not his name, but his signature, is visible in his collected works. The posing of the bodies conveys a message that cannot be translated because we have no words for that level of hatred. He didn't use a shotgun on Levine. He didn't use a pine cone with Beath. He didn't leave a sex manual with Polreich. That's right, they are different. He used to write with whatever he found. Now, what he wrote varied, didn't it? From scene to scene? Undeniably, they are all different, but he wrote in each case on the same surface, didn't he? He wrote on the broken bodies of the women he killed. He wrote, I suggest to you the same thing each time, a message to the victims, a message to the families, a message to the police, and a message to all of us. And what he said was, fuck you. And he said it 3 times. Mr. Russell said some very curious things about the killer and about the police who tried to catch him. To Bobby DeGroot, he said it was ridiculous that the police couldn't tell the same man killed all 3 women. He told Susie the cops were stupid not to make the connection. Indeed, one of the great ironies here is that it did appear to disturb Mr. Russell greatly that the police were never quoted in the paper as talking about these poses. As far as Mr. Russell could tell, these police were incredibly stupid. They stumbled into the scene, packaged up the bodies, dragged them away, and they ignored Mr. Russell's handiwork. For all they knew, they were dealing with a run-of-the-mill murderer. They didn't even acknowledge that it was one man, one special man, who did these killings. So, it's no wonder Mr. Russell was telling everyone who would listen how stupid the police were. He was insulted. He had gone to considerable time and trouble, hadn't he, to risk to him to pose these women in positions so that they would never be forgotten? He left his signature at the crime. He signed it anonymously, if you will. He didn't want to be caught, but he wanted to create an effect. He wanted to make the headlines. Serial murderer strikes again. And the headlines never came. Mr. Russell wanted the police to know what he wanted the world to know, and that was they weren't just dealing with anyone. They were dealing with somebody special. How special Mr. Russell really is ultimately your decision. It seems to me you have two decisions. You can agree with the defense, and you can look at this case as nothing more than coincidence after coincidence after coincidence, stacked one on top of the other, hundreds deep, all pointing towards Mr. Russell, and all pointing toward Mr. Russell just by chance. You can agree with the defense that as a result of this miraculous set of coincidences, George Waterfield Russell is just the hapless, helpless, dumb dupe of faith. Or, it seems to me, you can agree with your common sense, with the prosecution and with Mr. Russell himself. You can find that he really is something special, something specially dangerous, something specially powerful, something specially cruel, and guilty as charged. Mr. Russell was going to California, San Diego. I think he said, if you have a reasonable doubt that he killed these women, let him go. He'll find new friends. There is no shortage of naive, trusting, foolish young people in the cities of this country. He will settle in. He will begin looking for work. You could say he will be hunting for a job, and he will find it. If you have a reasonable doubt that he's the killer, let him go. Mary Polreich, Carol Beeth, and Andrea Levine. Mr. Russell has had his success. You will never be able to hear these names without seeing and feeling images of cruelty, depravity. That's why I'm going to end the way I began, with the photos of these women in life. It's the least I can do. Individually, he murdered them. Together, they are the collected works of George Waterfield Russell. The jury deliberated for 22 hours. They returned with guilty verdicts for a charge of first-degree murder and 2 charges of aggravated first-degree murder. He was given 2 terms of life imprisonment plus 28 years. George Russell was offered an opportunity to address the court before being dismissed, but he declined. He offered no apologies or other words of regret to the families of the victims. To quote Marianne Polreich's mother, Nancy, I'd like to have him say he's sorry, but he doesn't think like we do. He doesn't feel like we do. George Russell communicated with the media following the trial. He maintained that he was innocent and that he was railroaded by police because he was black. He declared his intention to file an appeal. In an interview with KOMO-TV, he said the murders were no big deal. To quote Russell, not to be desensitized or anything, but this area for years, since Bundy and everything, has had astronomical amounts of bodies being found in the woods or in clumps or whatever. It's something that's in the paper every day. It's almost common. George Russell is currently incarcerated at Clallam Bay Corrections Center. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.